If everybody is ready, can you hear us on Zoom? Is anybody on there? Give us a thumbs up or applause. Being a little bit late, yeah. Okay. Maybe we shall proceed, and if you can't hear us, please do a wave. We are calling to order the special Telluride Housing Authority meeting of Thursday, June 13th, 2024 at 9 a.m. We are here in Rebecca Hall and also on Zoom. Present are all members of the THA board, except for Commissioner Meehan Fee. She's going to be a little bit late. And number one, our work session is on the topic of discussion of Telluride employee rental housing policies, which is a continued discussion of the tiers discussion. And I will let our staff members take it.
Okay, great. Good morning. Thank you. I think this is meeting 4 in this series with the full THA. At our last meeting, which was just last Tuesday, we went through many of the policies that we were hoping to get direction on, and we did. We thank you for that as we move forward with a draft document. And where we left off was not quite midstream, a little past midstream with the discussion of AMI, application to rent, to the rent structure. So we are back to talk to you about the tier item. The data dump was huge. My sincere apologies that it came to you yesterday. Each time I thought I had it finished, a new piece of information would come to light, and I needed to add to it for you. I would like to see this meeting go largely the way it did on June 4th, which is having Allie and I as staff listen to your discussion, take away what your concerns are, any suggestions you have for us, and answer questions as needed. And then after we do the tier discussion, and we are very hopeful we will get through the bulk of that, if not all of it this morning. You may need more options going forward, but potentially hone them in for us. And then we are hoping to get to the other ancillary items that were added into this document, such as the pet policy. That way we really can come forward back to you on the 25th with a first draft of this document. I did want to also mention that we had our first 2 public outreach meetings at the AHA Sky Deck on Monday evening and Tuesday morning. There were, I think, 3 in-person attendees on Monday night and 1 or 2 on Zoom. And then on Tuesday morning, we didn't have anyone come and we called the meeting. But as we were sitting around just sort of talking about process going forward for creating a draft document, one individual came upstairs and we did hang around and answered questions for that person, just to let you know. And we are planning on having more public outreach meetings. Of course, all of these meetings are open to the public, but we do want people to feel empowered to come to have a conversation with us in a setting that isn't necessarily just a full-blown public meeting. And with that, I guess we could just jump right into the additional materials that you received. There is a lot of information there, and I did my best to make it as clear as possible by breaking out each of those tables. I don't know if it would be preferred or helpful for us to share screen at some point. I will pull it up in the background as I am saying these things. The direction that we heard at the June 4th meeting was to have a different level of earned income target rent. 22% for Shandoka and 25% for the additional buildings. The one piece that we will need more clarification on, and I think this speaks to how we have gone down this road for everything thus far, is that the boarding house needs to kind of be carved out. And at some point we would like better clarification on how we want to treat the boarding house. So taking that aside, Shandoka, we were told, please show us what 22% for a targeted rent would look like, 22% of earned income, 25% at the other properties. I decided after speaking with other staff members about, and this came up at the June 4th meeting, the ongoing concern for debt obligation, especially on our newer properties, that it would probably be more beneficial to all of you to just see all of the data. 22% for Shandoka, but I also added in 25%, which would keep it still at a lower standard than we already use for our other properties. But I did put in 30% just so you had the full picture. For Virginia Placer and Sunnyside, those would have been from your direction at 25%. I did include 30%, which is the standard for most places, but I wanted you to have, again, the full picture. I included the current rents at each of those properties. And I thought it was important, especially based on a few of the questions we have posed to you, to include what is called fair market rent, which is what HUD uses for their housing voucher program. We do have less than a dozen people, but about 10 who use a housing choice voucher in our town-owned rental housing. And that is the standard that is used for affordability for that program. I just thought that would be a helpful piece of information. Pardon me. Unless anyone does not want to go this route, I am going to just jump into the questions that we have posed to you so that you can start deliberating on those.
Well, something that occurred to me, I love all this data and I think we're all excited to dig into it. I was surprised at how low the rents we're getting with the 22% and seeing that folks at the 100%, weren't going to see any increase until further along in the tiers. But a nuts and bolts thing we haven't really discussed, and tell me if we shouldn't discuss it yet, but is the bond obligations. And if we are targeting it lower than 30%, does that affect our ability to get bonds approved or to finance these projects that we already have going? Because I would hate for us to spend a bunch of time negotiating all this other stuff when this, targeting a 22% or a 25% multiplier isn't really on the table for us overall, even though we want to, in our hearts, we want to work towards this. I don't know if you've had time to sort of talk through that with Lance or.
I think the best property to use in this example is Virginia Placer. It's not the newest, but it's relatively new, 2018. And within the past year or two-ish, it has become, with its overall operating budget, it is its own enterprise fund. It also works in tangent enterprise fund-wise with the boarding house. It has become, for lack of a better term in my brain right now, flush. It's still supporting itself right now with very little help. If we adjust down those rents, we do have concern that it won't be able to remain flush and meet its debt obligation for the bonds that exist on that property.
Is that even factoring in the rents that will go up? I know it's a different situation
So
in every building.
this is where I'm going to probably be halting in my responses. I want to select my words carefully because the smaller a project is, it's a small town. People know who live there. And I want to be protective of people's personal information. Even if I don't say names, sometimes things just kind of come to light. I guess the best answer for that is there are enough people living at Virginia Placer who fall into the lower two proposed tier structures, A and B, that the balance may not occur with the couple of people who are at the higher end. I think that it could get skewed down far enough by the current tenants who are occupying there that it might not meet its obligations. Speaking to Shandoka, there are enough people at the first two tiers being proposed that if it was to go down to 22%, I believe even in the C tier, because if you look, some of those rents in the C tier aren't meeting current rents. Those numbers could diminish the reserves enough at Shandoka, even with the few higher rents, that those reserves may not be able to be flush enough to help support the other properties that may need infusions in the next few years.
And that's even with the fact that we know that 60% of people are over income. We're just not, if we do a lower multiplier, we're not seeing their rent, those specific rents go up. Right?
Yes, where this is unknown to me is we haven't had direction yet where you want that upper limit to be. If it's tier E or if it's tier F, or if you want to contemplate tier G at certain properties for those individuals who say, I want secure housing. I want to be in something that's not going to be sold in 6 months. I'm willing to pay this much for my rent at this property. So that piece is a little bit still unknown.
Does anybody else have questions about this kind of topic before we dive into the?
I guess I just want to clarify. So what you're saying is that at the lowest percentage AMIs, like 25s and the 22s, there might be some issues to where maybe we need to start considering 25, 30. Is that kind of the basis of this conversation?
Yes.
I mean, there's another number in there, 27, which would have to make you have to do a bunch of math.
And
But
I can do it. Like now I'm on a roll.
I mean, there's 28, there's 27 and a half.
I mean, speaking for myself, and I'd love to hear anybody else in council chime in, having a multiplier a little bit less than 30 sounded really enticing to me based on the cost of living in Telluride and how hard it is to make it here. And we picked some numbers. My initial reaction is that 22% is too low. It's gonna make too many rents go down. But you know, there's more levels that we can split this.
Can I add one more piece and that may speak to? When you look at, and I apologize, the one pager I didn't have in a format to add into here. It's in the 6-4. Actually, it wasn't in the one pager. In the 6-4 packet, there was a table that showed you by household, how many households were over income by how much. There are 24 households in total of the 140, and I did break that down. It's 100 this is of the data we've received. 100 at Shandoka, 17 at Virginia Placer, and 27 at the boarding house. Of the 24 households who are at the very lowest end of the income spectrum, based on this tier structure, 1/3 of those are on housing choice vouchers. Their situation is already, for all intents and purposes, remedied. There are a few, I'm gonna say 4, that I have learned in the last 48 hours, just from trying to get more information. The self-stated income is not accurate. And they are not actually in those that lowest tier, and maybe not even in tier B. As of right now, the only measure we're using is income tax returns. And there are other sources of income that are therefore not being reported unless it is through conversation. We're going to hopefully, as part of this process, amend our application to try and garner that information. In a nutshell, what I am trying to say about this tier A level and the 24 households is it isn't as dire for that lowest level as we may have originally thought. I believe, in looking back through the list, that there are probably 3 households who do not have a housing voucher and actually are in that lower spectrum. Legitimately, sorry, but yes. I think that instead of legislating for a handful or less of people, that there are other resources in our community that can potentially help those folks so that we aren't letting the most needy fall through the cracks, but not legislating for only a few people when it seems as if at least half or more of the number of that tier A concern group are actually gonna be fine.
Would one way to address that be to sort of combine the tiers A and B? And have the AMI rent targeting be at like 55% or something, like a little bit lower, and then we don't have the ultra low rent. We have something that is appropriate for, does everybody follow what I'm
I
saying?
think what she's saying is that we shouldn't make a rule for this smaller group of people because there are other resources that can bolster them. And it's more important for us to then make sure that those people get those resources rather than creating kind of an anchor that's going to pull everything down ultimately.
And that's kind of what I'm addressing here is instead of having a tier A that's limitation is 60% AMI, our lowest tier tops out at 80% AMI. So we combine those two. If you're looking at the proposed rental tier structure, we have sort of
Yeah.
the 80% and the 60%, but if we just make our lowest tier 80%, that scoops up everybody and makes sort of our lowest rent is higher than it would be if we had a separate tier.
I think we should still have the tier though. I think from a data perspective, I think that just moving into the future, just knowing that differential and separating that group of individuals out could be useful. So I would hate to kind of overgeneralize anybody under 80%. I think it makes more sense to have it be under 60 and then 60 to 80, because I think that is a very specific razor's edge there. So I'd like to just kind of keep it that way, have a policy that works for most. And then, certainly we can always look for like exceptions. And then the exception, no, I mean, I'm just saying if there is something
sounds
that
like
we need
there's
to
other
do, there's like
resources.
other things that we could do for those individuals.
Dan, go ahead.
My comment's more back to the conversation around the percentage of income target, that discussion. And I just want to contextualize it and really have everyone consider, everyone knows where I lie, so I don't need to go on and on, but as we get closer to 30% of income for our target, I just really make sure we want to consider that HUD considers 30% of income. Beyond that is cost burdened. And as we approach that, if we are keeping people in a housing system that doesn't allow them to build equity, I want to make sure that we factor that in and make sure that we provide opportunity for long-term sustainability and success in Telluride. And if we're setting an income target that's closer to 30%, while trapping people in a system that is rental and they're never able to recoup any equity, that's a factor in our minds, because I think that that's very important as part of this conversation.
We kind of deviated from what I was gonna say, but with the A and B, the tiers A and B, I think those are also the people who are gonna be affected the most by rent jumps. So I think having more tiers to kind of soften those increases is helpful. Even if some people have aid and some people maybe aren't reporting income correctly, I don't think our policy should reflect people who are doing things outside of these tables. I think we should just focus on the data at hand. I guess to respond to what Dan just said, I did have a little bit of Geneva, what you said about how I was kind of surprised at how low some of these rents were. I also hear what you're saying, Dan, and I was the one who initially proposed going down to 22. So like, I'm with you, but I do think some of these are kind of shockingly low. And if it puts our housing authority, our housing department in these enterprises in a tough spot if we don't know if we're going to be able to continue to fund things or pay off our bonds, then the system isn't working. So like, I think it's important that we make sure we have enough money to keep the system intact, because if we lower rents to the point that we're not able to pay our bonds, we're defaulting on, our loans, then it's not working. So
And we're
I want
violating the
nothing
law.
more than to tell a bunch of people that their rent is
Yeah.
gonna go down. But I think that we do need to be responsible in how we address like the budget on the whole. And I don't know that we've gone fully down that road to see, we won't know the answer until we see who decides to stay in their units and, how that rent shakes out over the next few years. So I don't know who's got the crystal ball, but.
I guess my initial response is like, it's important that we be able to cover our basic costs. I'm gonna keep this really brief because it can be. And then I think to Dan's point, our goal too is to also hopefully be able to get people into like owner occupied affordable housing or maybe even privately owned eventually. So like targeting a price that where people aren't living paycheck to paycheck, I think is also super important. So, and I know there's a magic equation. We don't know what it is of where we can cover our operating costs and give people a little more freedom, with being able to put stuff into their own reserves.
Okay, well, now that we are philosophized on some things, should we try and work our way through the questions?
That sounds great. Okay. So this feeds into what you were all just saying. At the last meeting, we were directed that the majority of council does want to do a tiered system. So what should the tiers be? How many tiers should there be? And what should the distribution be within the projects or across the projects? I think within is where we landed for terminology last time. And then the other, so that's kind of one bulk question. And then should there be a top end limit for AMI?
So in the proposed rental tier structure, and maybe this is just, so like going from B to C, B goes up to 80% and then C starts at 75%.
No.
Am I looking at an old?
No. So the AMI rent target is the affordability
Oh,
target.
target, got it. It's not the, I see.
And then the household limit would be the,
I thought those were a high and low.
So it's like 60 to 80, or 0 to 60, 60 to 80, 80 to 100. Those are the boundaries of the.
Okay, and then the rent that we're assigning to these tiers, is that rent a percentage of the lowest income in that tier group or the target?
so if you go down to the next table, the first one for Shandoka, for example, the way we typically do this is if it's a 1-bedroom unit, we have the minimum household requirement now. So a 1-bedroom unit is a 1-person household. That's where the target rent is coming from. It's based on a 1-person household. A 2-bedroom, 2-person household, a studio, a 1-person household, etc. So that targeted rent for a 1-bedroom unit at 45% AMI is based on 45% of a 1-person household's AMI at that range.
So what happens if you're at the limit? So let's say if the target was the 45, but you actually make 60% AMI, are you going to be out of compliance then because you're not going to be paying enough?
If you pay if you're at 61, you'd be,
That is the threshold that would drop you. So that's
Mhm.
why then you have to move into the next tier.
yeah.
And then you're still paying 20, 22, 25, 30% of, before you hit 61, you're at 60, you're paying 22, 25, 30% of a 45% AMI income.
If you're in tier A, yes.
Okay,
Well,
so anyone, so we're kind of starting at the bottom of these tiers to calculate the rent. So there's not a situation where someone would be in a rent tier and because they're on the bottom end of the rent tier, they're actually paying 35% of their income, right?
Well, in tier A, that could be a possibility, but
less
we're
than
gonna
the
find
bot-
ways.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
If you look at the proposed rent tier structure table, table 1, let's take C, for example, you can make between 80 and 100% AMI, that's the range. But, or 81, excuse me, 81% to 100% AMI range, but the AMI rent target is 75. So even if you're at the very bottom, that 81%, 75% is the rent.
got it. So
Same for if you're at
And
Yeah, so there, people are more likely to be paying less than these percentages of their actual income because of the rent tier.
No
That's what
matter
I,
what.
that's what I wanted to
Yeah.
clarify, because if it was, we were sort of shooting at the middle of that tier, then the people on the lower end of it might be stressed. So, thank you. That was,
I mean, I think
good
that's a
answer.
really great point, and a way in which we have, if we adopt this policy, even though we're, if we base it on 30% to go towards the health of our, enterprise funds, no matter what, people are paying less than the 30% of their actual income, because it's starting at 75%, and as they move up within the tier, it's going to get to be a smaller and smaller and smaller amount.
and then when they jump into tier D, it
It's
still is
below.
90. Yeah. So that makes me feel a lot better about the percentages that we've been talking about, because we're not going to be in excess of 30% on any of these tables.
I think that is a really key point, and maybe there are some more charts, if we end up moving forward with the 30%, other kinds of charts that we could make that could illustrate that, on a more granular level, like within the tier, because I mean, we've all been looking at these for a while, and we just sort of honed in on that point.
I love real world examples, not necessarily real people, but to plug in real numbers. John Doe works at whatever, and he makes this much money. This is where he would fall in the spectrum, and here's his affordability. Those can be done. I don't know if that I think today, by the end of the meeting, we'd like to have dates potentially for new confirmed dates for public outreach meetings. And I think that what you're talking about, could be very helpful and illustrative to the public.
Yeah, I mean, if we start zooming in on each tier,
Okay.
I mean, the difference between like for tier D, for example, the difference between 119% AMI and a 90% rent is a big difference.
agree.
And that becomes much cheaper than 30% of your income as you move up through the tier.
And that's what we were really trying to do, because we have heard loud and clear that we want people to be able to thrive, and having these cushions built in is an attempt to do that. But to go back to the question, what should the tiers be? This is just a proposal. If you think that there's a better approach or split, that's what we want to know from you. How many tiers should there be? Do you like the A through F? Did you want to go to G? What should that look like?
I mean, based on this discussion, I feel like the jump from E to F is really big, and we have 25%. Sorry, we have a 20% AMI jump between tiers C and D, and then a 30% jump. And I wonder if maybe we want to keep the 20% sections. Does that make sense to folks?
You mean 15%?
So 60 to 80%.
Oh,
Looking at
down
the
here,
bottom
okay.
line. Cause then
On the
we
limitation.
have
Well, we do,
somebody-
it looks like it ramps
Yeah.
up towards the end. Cause then it's a jump of 50% from E to F,
Right, which is even
30
bigger.
and then 50. I mean, I guess the question is that when you're at those higher AMIs, you have just straight numbers. I'm not talking about availability of housing, but just straight up like money available to you. You have more financial options.
Mhm.
And so I'm less concerned about like seeing this kind of ramp up. I'm also, after going through all of this and, learning more about it and definitely understanding it a lot more, there's a part of me that says, I'm even okay with no income limit as long as you're willing to pay the percentages of your income. And you want to pay 30% of your income to live in this housing, you're going to pay a lot. But if that works for you, then that.
I think I can get on board with that, but what I'm saying is, if you look at tier E, somebody is within that tier and they're making 149% AMI, but they're still paying 120% rent. And that is a big difference than in the other tiers.
You're saying it's the
So their-
opposite.
Their rent is staying
be
low
much more
proportionally
suppressed.
because there's just more room in that
For them to
tier. And
move.
so if we tighten up the tiers and maybe there's more tiers, like I'm into this idea of no limit if you're willing to pay for it. I really am. I didn't think I was gonna be there, but I am. But I think that the relationship between the rent target and the limitation and the range from tier to tier should be consistent instead of widening, because then we are subsidizing the higher income earners more because they're further away from the rent target. Does that make sense to people?
So do you just say then that we have we end it at one point and then say anything above this, it's just 30% of your AMI is paid in rent?
We could say that. I think it would be easier to keep the rule consistent. I just think that like in tier F, if somebody's making 199% AMI, which is 49%
yeah, than
higher than
100.
their rent, that is a huge amount of subsidy or a huge amount of difference.
I get what you're saying.
Compared to C, which is half of that. Like you're only getting 25% maximum above your income.
No, I get what
30%
you're
of
saying.
your
Yeah, yeah.
income. I understand. So I would be advocating for having after C or to rework the tiers so that they are more similar in the relationship between the rent target and the limitation and the distance between the tiers. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm explaining.
You are.
My question brings us back just a little bit, but this scenario, I'm just trying to make sure I understand the group's position correctly. Scenario of unrelated roommates, grouped into one household, which is, I think, how we landed at last meeting. Say they're at 119 AMI as a household. One person already earns more than the other. The person earning more gets another raise and bumps them up to the next tier, to the E tier. And so one person is earning more, but both persons in that household are paying more rent, even if with the lower income. And that's where we landed, and that's where everyone's still okay.
I think it's the roommate's responsibility to figure out how the rent is distributed. Like that is a level of micromanaging. That's not our responsibility. But if one person is causing the rent to go up, I think the equitable thing in that household to do is be like, this rent is bumped up, like take the nicest room, get the best windows, but you're also paying more. But they can figure that out on their
And
own.
I think that's a real world situation that has happened with every group living situation that I've ever been in, where we all made different amounts of money and there were different or better or worse rooms. We had to work it out.
Yeah, if somebody there's one parking spot and somebody is gonna get the parking spot, so they're gonna pay more per month, or you're gonna, like, this is all things that people as individuals have to determine. We don't need to legislate that to them.
No way. That's endless.
Yeah.
I mean, let them figure it out.
I mean, the alternative is, we already talked about it, is renting room by room, and that is creating more problems than it's solving, in my opinion.
I would say there's
Relax,
another
just roll
alternative,
to the
but we
back of our
discussed
head.
it and we don't need to go through it. I just wanted to hear the group's
Alternative to
reaction,
not do tiers at all, is that what you mean?
or tiers by project instead of tiers by
Yeah.
within projects.
I think we're all aligned that this is the right way forward, and that portion of it is an imperfect part of it, but there's not a pragmatic solution.
Just wanted to hear your reaction. Thank you.
I did want to comment on something that was being said about having no income cap. I actually do think an income cap is still important, because there is a point where we need the housing more than we need the person's extra rent money. Like getting back to what is the purpose of the housing program, and it's to house underserved people. So just before that gets planted and starts growing wings, I actually, I do think that an income cap is important.
I'm okay with figuring out an income cap. I could go either way on it, but I think we should base it on something and not just pick a number. And I don't know how we do that.
Well, I
The affordability gap, I don't know if anybody saw the CNN article, but the affordability gap for purchasing a house is $600,000 between our median income in our county, between our
NBC
median
purchase.
income
Close.
and the median household price. But we're talking rental. So if we can get some free market rental information to base it off of, maybe that's a boundary, but I don't know. But we're not talking about that.
Well, I think
We kind of are.
you're talking about how many tiers should there be?
Yep.
And then what, should there be a top end limit? That is one of the questions. I just wanted to clarify for, consensus so that when we move forward from direction from council, what I heard was this is my words for what you were saying, rework the tiers to have the same distance between the, levels.
Same distance between the levels and same relationship between income and rent targeting.
Okay. And I heard that from the chairwoman. I'm just,
That's just, so
Make
we
it-
all know what's gonna happen with that. That means that we're gonna have more tiers. Which to me, I'm less worried about the number of tiers because it all should just be a math function. All you're doing is plugging numbers in. So even if we have an infinite number of tiers, it's okay.
but please don't.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm just saying, like, practically what we're agreeing to, so then when we see it next time, we will have more tiers, but it shouldn't change the function in any way.
I agree. I just don't want to see like an exponential, the curve that's presented here ends up having us subsidizing higher income earners more within
Yeah.
the tier.
Agreed.
I think should be linear.
So 3.
Yeah, and then that, once, just to confirm Ashley's point, let's just say there had to be 2 more tiers or whatever that number is. Because it is that formula and what you're doing, it's the only extra work it's creating is that you might have to move people between tiers more. Is there anything else? I mean, is that a problem for staff, you and staff?
I don't foresee it as a problem. I mean, it's gonna be growing pains to get it implemented. However, we do this on an annual basis when lease renewals come up, and at least theoretically, unless it's a new project, and every lease comes up at the same time at one particular project, they're spaced out throughout the year, so it isn't, we reevaluate people's qualification each year. So once I have my new person in the office, it's gonna be. So then the second part of that first question is, should there be a top end limit? And I think that if you want to come back to it, that's fine. If we want to go through a few other parts of the questions, but it has been touched on, and it would be very helpful for us to know.
Did the fair market, so the HUD fair market rents, I guess I'm just trying to determine, like, there would be a point, if we did all the fancy math, which actually wouldn't be that fancy, but there would be a point where you making a certain amount of money, it would make more sense for you to maybe go into the free market rather than continue in our subsidized housing, because there's no restriction on income, and you could probably find some place where it's like, like I said, the house up in Ski Ranches, that's $5,500 for a 3-bedroom, where there's gonna be a point where it's like, that is actually beneficial to you because you're not gonna be spending 30% of your AMI to live there. You'll be spending more like 20 or 25%, or you could even spend 5%. It doesn't matter because it's the free market. There has to be kind of a moment in that where that starts to meet.
But I think, are you saying that we should let the tenants decide when that point is?
No, I'm saying
Okay,
like, we
okay.
could figure that
Okay,
out.
cool.
I feel like, I mean, we could run numbers and try and see that. I'm of the opinion that I think practically having a cap makes sense, just because I think that it's just, then we don't have to, it's just easier, it's cleaner, I think, and I agree with that. And so I guess, I mean, that you have 250% on here as a top end in G.
And that's more than we allow for our ownership program, right? Because tier 4 tops out at 220. Just to get into it anyway.
But there isn't a continuing qualification.
Totally.
I think it's 250.
It's not more than 250. I don't have the
Yeah.
guidelines in front of me.
That's
but
why I
it's somewhere
picked
in
it.
that range.
Oh,
Well, I think the other side of it too is
But it's different.
what the program is intended to be. And right now, we don't have enough units for everyone. And so if at this particular juncture, if we are saying that we are not gonna have an income cap at all, that you can stay in these units for as long as you want, as long as you
Forever.
qualify, however, there is an entire subsection of our population that should be receiving further subsidy and further assistance through this program that won't be able to get into the program because there are people that have higher means and better flexibility that will be utilizing units when they would be more appropriately placed in the free market. And so I just don't think that I think right now we need an income cap really to protect the people that are at the lowest end of our economic sector.
It's a tough one because you can look at both sides where I generally lean towards having that income cap and helping the people who need that support more. But on the flip side, we know where Telluride in the immediate region is trending, which is less rentals, long-term rentals at any price, just because we have, people have the technology to spend more time here as, second homeowners, part-time owners, and then full-time owners. And so even at the higher end, as long as they qualify and they're contributing to Telluride and to our region by how they work and what they do and paying the fair share, is that something that might lead us to think about not having one? And like I said, I lean towards having one, but it's also like, it's not, even at the higher ends of rent, it's not that easy to just jump into the free market either.
I think,
Tier 4 is to 20% top
It is.
max.
Okay.
Yeah, it's 180 to.
I think the danger zone is turning these housing projects into like capitalist ventures. And if we end up with a lot of high income earners just paying high rent in our deed restricted housing, in our affordable housing, it sort of, I think, is deviating from the mission of the housing. And it's like, oh, let's make this money because we can. That's a free market mentality. And that is, I think, just there's a moral like,
And what people voted to increase our taxes and fees for
Right.
affordable housing.
yeah. So I think we're losing the point of it if we don't at some point say this is appropriate. And maybe like, I'm okay with that being a high number. Maybe it is 250, like just because the ownership guidelines say something else doesn't mean we have to follow that number. Like it doesn't need to be, prohibitively low, but I do think at some point we need to put like our foot down and be like, this isn't for you. We built this for someone else.
Just for reference, in our Telluride Affordable Housing Guidelines for this year's HUD numbers, the table maxes out at 220% AMI. A one-person max for that is $168,000. Two-person is $193,000. Three-person is $217,000. Four-person's $241,000 a year. So
The 2-person isn't that high though.
the two-person isn't that high. The 3 and 4-person start getting up there.
The 1-person AMI is obviously significantly higher. That's 160,000. That's pretty significant. Two-person AMI, because remember, we're talking about a household. That's 2 individuals in a bedroom that in their own bedrooms is a 2-person household. So at 190 AMI, that's $80,000 a piece. That's not astronomical for this area. So I would say if we're going to put a cap, which it sounds like everybody mostly wants that, which again, I'm fine with it. I think that we should consider a higher end of that just because it's going to affect groups of people, especially families and stuff like that. So that where, if you make $190,000, you're not going to be able to purchase a $1.5 million condo in the area. So I would lean us to put a cap, but maybe look at where's the upper part of that we feel the most comfortable with.
Well, is there a way we can work backwards to that based on what the 100% AMI is?
Well, and I also think we need to be mindful of, we've talked about what are the comps we're actually comparing to. Is it a $1.5 million condo in Telluride, or is it a $750 3-bedroom home in Lawson?
Mhm.
So I think that's also something worth considering, because if you're, making, what's the 2-bedroom that you read off?
2-bedroom,
Or 2-person household?
of what level AMI?
220, because that was the highest.
Yeah.
220 is $192,940.
If you're making almost $200,000 a year with you and your partner or with a kid, at that point, you can like go into the Lawson home, or maybe there is something, like, I don't know if it's realistic that the comps to jump to the free market are within the Telluride limits, because those prices are so inflated that I just don't know if that is the best. And
Sure,
Well,
I
it's-
agree with what you're saying.
you what?
I was just saying it is an inventory thing too.
Yeah.
We can quote that there are a few units for sale. It's just-
There's down valley too. I mean, I think we have to look at the reality of the situation, and it's not what we want it to be, but it is what we have now. And we're setting these parameters because they have never existed, but that doesn't mean that we are setting them for the next 30 years either. I think this is something that we are setting for now. We are evaluating in 2 years, we are evaluating 2 years after that, and 2 years after that, and if things can change, then they change, with whatever that council decides, but.
How many people, if we set 250, right, we're comfortable with 250% AMI, how many people in our current housing would that displace, just so that we have that number?
2.
Two, okay.
Just so you know, we share an office with RHA, and so we're often having conversations about what units are available. And I will meet with those families on occasion when they come in, and we're in conversations about going to the bank and getting a loan approval, like an amount. And they want to move into ownership, those households that are affected in this way. So, 2.
I took a, as part of our real estate licenses, we have to do continuing education. So I took an affordable housing education class through, one of the real estate continuing eds. And one thing that they really talked about was creating systems of mentorship, and like, so that you have, a way for people when they're moving into affordable housing, they have, different mentors, be it from the bank, be it from, the housing authorities with the deed restriction limits, a real estate agent. So obviously that isn't what we're talking about right now, but it's just something to keep in the back of our mind, that this might be for us, for these people in these higher income limits, that we start saying, hey, so here's how this thing works, like what you're talking about, and kind of maybe solidifying that so that we can have the upper limit and then say, don't worry, this isn't like you're just going to get pushed off a cliff. Like, we're going to help shepherd you through the process of like home ownership or getting into free market rental, whatever that is.
I think why we shouldn't beat ourselves up over 2 people and just set it at 250. And just the 2 points to make, just to consider down the road, is that a lot of times if they're unrelated parties, they're not going to be buying houses together. That's a whole nother equation that we have to keep in mind. And then the second point on the flip side of that is not the town of Telluride, but regionally. So the town, the county, the mountain village, we really just have to be aware of, and none of us will be sitting at this table at this point, but future goals where you create the housing that then cannot have the restrictions at a larger scale, to create the visible steps for people to get less and less restricted. And I'm not going to say they'll get out of some type of subsidy or some type of program because the free market is so expensive, but at least have these tiers to get out. And those are, that's way down the road to figure it out, but maybe that's a good goal that we can work on. But I don't think we should, if 2 people are over 250, let's set it at 250 and move on. And Mian made a great point. We analyze this every couple of years, and if we need to adjust, we will.
For reference, the 250% AMI for a 2-person household would be $219,000. So I think also another advantage of doing a higher AMI cap is going to be making more room for those unrelated parties to avoid going over income.
I do think it's important. I think Teddy touched on it, and it's worth emphasizing I just want to provide consideration of if you have a 2-person household at that 250 limit, but they're unrelated. And if you broke that down into single person households, well, then it's much closer to 130, 135% AMI as a single person household. And so I just want to make sure that there's accommodation in that. If you have 2 unrelated people doing pretty well for themselves, but lumped together as a single household, but when you take them apart, if both of them were to lose their housing at 130% AMI, I think we can all recognize that that's not a given to be able to find free market housing in this current market.
Well, but we're allowing them to stay. I think that's the point.
After 250 at a two-person household, no, I don't think that's what we're saying.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I think that even at, you know, what, you said it was like 219.
219 for a two-person household would be the max if we set 250 as the max.
So I suppose my point is more about how we calculate household. Again, two unrelated people doing pretty well for themselves, but when lumped together, it appears as though they're doing extraordinarily well, even though the only expense that they share is their housing costs.
But
they're-
those are significant. I mean, you've made that argument before, and those are significant costs, especially if we're looking at our programs, you know, so they are, it is their rent, it is their heat, it is their utilities. They don't share a cell phone bill, perhaps, but I think I think the question is then like, what's the accommodation made for the couple that is sharing as well? Because they're both working full time, and then they both have, you know, reasonable salaries as well. Are they then being penalized because they, you know, because they're a couple versus not being individuals? If we are gonna raise that income level for single roommates?
I think you're talking around my point a little bit here, Mian, because my point is the way in which we're calculating household. If we were to set that limit for that household, those two unrelated people lose their housing. They will likely then be looking for housing on their own because it's much easier to find a place for just one person instead of two people together. And so then you have a person who is now on their own, not being calculated as a two-person household. And that one person is much closer to 130% AMI and now has to go find housing for themselves.
Delaney.
I don't know if it matters, but that living situation is not one of the two households that is over the 250%. It's not a roommate situation, just currently, just letting you know that.
And do we feel that if we have, you know, two friends that are living together and they reach the upper echelon, they reach that 255%, that they would not be able to go back onto the accommodation,
wait
the
list?
transfer list as two individuals looking for individual units? I mean, I
mean-
think they would be able to, and then it would carry, but, and similarly, I think the other side of it too is, you know, if a couple is living in one of our units and they choose to end that relationship, they're in a very similar situation as well. If they choose to divorce, then yes, like they would be in a similar situation. So I think we have to look at the totality of what that would be, not just if they're roommates or if they're married or whatever in a domestic partnership. I think we just have to look at the numbers really ultimately for that.
It feels like no matter where we draw the line, and we've experienced this in our policies and in our guidelines before, no matter where we draw the line, we will be able to think of examples of people who fall outside of it and that get left behind. But I think to Elena's point about what is the goal of our program and affordable housing, and what people in the public voted for when they voted for property mill levies and sales taxes and all of these things for affordable housing, we have to draw the line somewhere. Do we feel like we're ready for a straw poll on a number, on the 250 number, at least for moving forward? Oh, Delaney.
Could you make it either 240 or 260? Just because if you want me to rework the table in increments of 20%, it will just be a little easier. 260.
Great. Okay. The next question is, should tiers be reserved only for upward mobility of existing tenants or new tenants who qualified under a lower tier? Or should households be able to initially qualify under any tier?
That question arose from conversations that we heard about, I think it goes to what Jesse, Ray, and Elena had spoken to about, and others, I'm sure, but those are the ones that stick out in my mind of, we're really trying to help people get into units, and I think Mian pointed this out today, get into units who are really in need. So if somebody's at 258% AMI and we've got 10 people who are at 70% AMI, that's kind of where that question came from, just to give you a frame of reference.
So I'm gonna try and get a good analogy, because we've had good analogies. So we have this ladder of our tier system. Do we want to have a maximum that people can get onto the ladder for as they progress up? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I think it makes sense to me, and
I do
it's
too.
the way that we will be able to protect the lower income units to exist at all. As people, like, let's say a family moves on, they're making more money, it would be great if we could flip that unit down and be available to lower incomes.
The idea being that if you can't make above a certain threshold to get into that unit, you can progress past that up into what we've now set at 260% AMI. But the barrier for entry, it's like, instead of like, you must be this high to ride, it's the opposite. Like, you must fit under this bar to get in. And then you're allowed to surpass that in your growth and in your time here, but that we're not creating this housing for people that are already at 200+% AMI, correct?
I think that that's the question, and so that some form of that makes sense. Where do we want to draw the line on that? Does it matter per project, or is it overall across all projects?
And you just want to keep the ladder balanced, kind of, right? And so if we assume everyone is moving up the ladder, we have to make sure those lower rungs of the ladder can still be available for people, because
Yeah.
we want everyone to move up the ladders. But we got
They
to take
can't
care
move
of
up
that
if
next
there's
group.
somebody in front of them, kind of thing.
Right, and exactly, and it's just the more you balance, I mean, everyone could just go up in tiers in their units, and then all of a sudden you lose out on having that affordability. So, I mean, I think we have to do whatever we can to protect the lower end.
My only question, or just, I don't think it's possible to answer now, but I would just be interested how that would impact revenue streams. And if we are prioritizing in this way, those lower income tiers, people, depending on whatever the economic situation of town is and just how things play out, if we implement that in a way that prioritizes and gets effectively more people at those lower AMI tiers in there, this system is generating less revenue out overall, and what is the implication for bonding and just covering costs of expenses with that? And that's that question I don't think staff can answer at this time, but it's something I think we should consider.
This question isn't for staff, it's actually for us. And so I totally get what you're saying. My question is though, when we create these projects, we can't, it's difficult for us. I don't even know if it's legal for us or whatever. Like, most funding mechanisms isn't going to give us a grant if we're saying we're building housing where you have to have a 200% AMI and 30% of your income to pay for it, and we're calling it affordable housing. A lot of times they have restrictions on the AMIs, like these are for people who make 100% AMI or less, or 120% AMI or less. So our projects have to be tailored around.
Their grants.
Yeah.
Bonds, like loans, they want us to do the higher income because that's more solid.
So I guess
We're
that's my
going
question is,
against our
that's the question is, it's really up to us when we're figuring out how we're gonna fund the project. That is beholden on us to say, okay, if we want people that are making 120% AMI or below, based on this policy that we're creating right now, we have to take that into account when we are funding the project.
Yeah,
Totally.
and that's what we do. And so it has been like a
Yes.
mix of, some of it can be grant and some of it is bonding. And we do establish that and, as we're kind of starting the project.
But I think when
So
Ashley's
if we
saying,
create the rule, we just have the rule in front of us when we're doing the project, and we say, hey, we've said for ourselves that we don't want to have any projects that the barrier for entry is above this or whatever. We keep that in mind when we're figuring out how we're going to fund it.
And we're also trying to keep a balance. And that's what I think what we're trying to figure out with this question is, do we want to protect a balance? And if our rules start skewing it one way or the other, we revisit it and we make changes.
And I think establishing the balance based on what we are being told are the income limits within the community is what makes sense. We have the upper limit of where we do not want to exceed. But then we take everything below it and we get those numbers and we say, we want our housing program to serve 20% of people under 60, 30% of people 60 to 90 or 60 to 100 or whatever it could potentially be. And then again, I think it's a really dynamic model that we're going to need to have so that it is truly reflective of the community that we have and who's living there and who needs the housing. And I know it's more work, but I think that way we're actually achieving what the true goal of the program is, which is to provide safe and stable housing for the people that need it.
Well, and to remember the way that when Lance goes to the bonding company, he says not, here's the AMI that we stay below. He says, here's an average AMI targeting that we have, and it has units above and units below. And I think that if we start, when we have a new project, if we start with that targeted average, and I'm pretty sure at Voodoo, we have already locked this in, what the average is going to be to satisfy the bond. And then we can pick the units and what tiers they go in to reach that average. And we start there. Then as people generally, I think, would be increasing their AMI percentage as they go, it's only going to get better. And then on the next project that we build, we can be like, okay, here's our target average here. And then we pick the units that fit into whatever AMIs to hit that average as well. So that's sort of how we can be dynamic and with a starting spot with a new building, and it would go up from there.
Could we find ourselves in a situation where we, because of the bonding
Forget what
that
I
we've gotten, that we say, okay, we're looking at these units that we have to fill or unit that we have to fill, and this is how much revenue this project is going to generate. Could we get ourselves into a situation where we say, we can't take anyone below this AMI, and then we can't take anyone above this AMI, and there's kind of like this sandwich effect where we say we can only take people who are making between 80 AMI and 140 AMI in order for us to have the bond
I mean, that's what
payments
we've
covered?
That's what we've done in projects in the past, but I worry about those early tiers.
That's what I'm saying. Like I'm not even saying like when we're filling a new project. I'm saying like as the project 10 years from now, we still have a payment that we have to make for the debt. And we've got 2 units that we have to fill. And right now we have, the building is making this much X number in our rent. And if we take people with this lower AMI, we're not going to satisfy the amount that we need for that rent. And so there will be a bottom for the AMIs that will need to satisfy the debt.
Isn't that antithetical to the goals stated at last meeting of providing equal opportunity to every AMI range? That's what I very clearly heard at the last meeting of you want these projects, and that's the idea of tiers, is to be able to provide equal opportunity to every AMI range at all of our
Not every
projects.
AMI range. I think like not
As many as
up
possible.
to 250. We are not looking for like 400% AMI.
Oh, okay,
yes,
well, that's
sir.
not what I meant,
Yeah,
but
I just
yeah.
want to be clear about that.
Okay, but sure, yes.
To your point, Dan, yeah, I do want to build new units that are available to lower AMI tiers. I think we're in this balancing act of funding the project, figuring out how we can look at our program as a whole, funding new construction, which is really expensive, which would be more advantageous to us financially to have higher AMIs, but we want to figure out a way to include tier A, B, C units in every new project for sure. I think each one
But
is gonna have unique challenges.
I think Ashley's question is a good one of what happens when our project is net negative.
We
Is,
put in more subsidy from our affordable housing fund.
okay then.
Kevin,
Yeah, just a couple comments. Generally, the bond documents don't look at unit by unit allocation per project. The typical language is something more like the rents will be set to support the bond payments and any O&M on the project. It's that broad. And how you arrive at that is a matter of your discretion. We also have generally a resolution of support from the town council of supplemental appropriation. So if THA is not able to make the required funding bond per bond or project per project, then the town council has what's called a moral obligation to look at further subsidizing provisions of financial support for that project. So it's never become an issue, and it's never been an issue of AMIs per unit. It's much broader than that generally, and it provides a lot of discretion to THA to set those rents. And we've never had a problem with, I mean, occasionally you have to adjust it, and you look at it, and we do, but we've never had a situation where the project has, from the start, I just want to make sure I think I could say that. We've never had that situation where from the start, we've had a situation where the rents are not covering the obligations, or we adjust the obligations, and the rental obligations from tenants rather quickly to make up for that. So it's something we adjust, and I think, we go through that budget process every fall.
I think we're like getting a little ahead of ourselves with future projects right now. I think like we've set a good framework for our current projects, but there's so many variables, like unforeseen variables in the future, construction costs, housing needs, there could be a recession. I think we've got philosophically really good framework for future projects, but I think we need to be prepared for what works now in our current projects may not be realistically appropriate for future projects, but we can take kind of this framework and apply it down the road. So I don't know if, I just feel like we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit.
So you don't want to apply this kind of framework to the
I
projects
do,
that
I think it's
exist?
great to the projects that exist, yes, but it sounds like we're trying to do something for future projects too, and I just don't know if that is realistic right now.
We're definitely trying to make policies that will carry forward into the future.
Yes, which
And-
I think we've got philosophically good framework, but like we don't know all the variables that could happen in the future. So I think we need to remind ourselves to be super flexible about some of these things. Like, should there be a recession? That would really affect some of these AMIs or the housing needs assessment. And I think the biggest takeaway is like what we need right now could be completely different than what we need in a year or in 2 years.
Well, I think that's true with any decisions we make, where if something drastic changes, we have to pivot and adjust.
And I do think, the purpose of these documents is that they'll kind of be like a master, like governing document across all of our projects. Unless I misunderstood the purpose of this exercise.
But that's the purpose.
Okay, so I think the whole point of this is to make something that applies to the future.
Lance, you've been nodding and
I just wanted
in the
to
back of the
clarify one of the points Ashley was making, which is, remember that the debt service on these projects is constant in the future. And so theoretically, wages do tend to increase. Sometimes they increase at a small rate, sometimes they increase at a high rate. So our debt service payments proportionally are more manageable each year that you go on. Now, as a project gets older, like Shandoka, then your capital outlays start going into that as well. But, for example, the debt service right now in Shandoka, I think is, I'll say 400 to 580,000 a year. The revenues are around 2 million. So that's how the project ages if you're doing things like that. But a lot of that money is going to fixing things. So-
Fixing things, and it sounds like bolstering other projects, right?
No,
no.
we're
Chile.
using some of the operational funds to help other projects operationally. But we've never had a situation where the town's not made a bond payment on a rental housing project.
And we currently,
The first application of the revenues will go to the bond obligation.
Yeah.
The debt obligation.
Because
Then-
we're legally bound to do that.
Then if there's bolstering needed, it's usually for, as Lance said, the operational
When we
costs.
had the recession, with COVID hit, that's when we were actually having to subsidize out of the Affordable Housing Fund operational expenses, say Virginia Placer, because we were not raising rents, we were deferring, we were doing things like that.
Hold on one second. I saw Antonio's hand go up, Tiffany. Just making sure that our interpreter is keeping up.
Might not have been able to hear.
Yeah, I was gonna say it might have been that microphone.
Oh, okay. Sorry,
yeah,
Tanner.
if you look at our budget, we have a Shandoka fund, a Virginia Placer fund, a Sunnyside fund, and their enterprise fund. So the money just stays within there. And if there was ever going to be money taken from the Shandoka fund and transferred to another project, we would have to approve that. So we always hear that. It's not like something happened behind the scenes.
And then wouldn't we be in a situation that if we started to not create that balance, that you would let us all know, and then we would have the opportunity to figure out how we're gonna approach it, whether we need more lower tier or more higher tiers to either make our payments or create more affordability. I mean, without exceptions and hearings and all that fun stuff, I like the fact that we give you guys some discretion on how you're already doing it that way and to continue that, but with the philosophy of we want to opening for the lower tiers so they don't get priced out, but we also have to make sure that we're balancing it well enough to pay our bills and have, some type of equitable opportunity across all tiers.
It's in practice already, but just at a smaller level, if you will, because right now the only project that works this way is Sunnyside. So as households at Sunnyside see these income increases, and it is happening after a year and a half-ish, because the first units have been there a year and a half, the apartments 1 year. As we see that occur, and when a unit opens up, we can make those adjustments. We had 2 vacancies occur, almost at the same time. One was a tier 1 unit, one was a tier 2 unit. But they're not assigned to the unit, it's assigned to the tenant. So we were able to, and then another one came open. Sorry, I'm going down a rabbit hole that I'm not explaining well, I apologize. We were able to shift down to a tier 1 for someone who needed it at Sunnyside because somebody else in a unit's income had gone up and they were now paying tier 2 rent. And there was another tier 2 unit available to rent. So those fluctuations occur organically as people become more successful and go up into the higher tiers. And then the revenues are still good. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was a very weird explanation.
I I think this is an agreeable statement, and I just want to put it out there and get a reaction, but, I just want to make sure we empower staff. Should there be a recession or some unforeseen circumstances, suddenly incomes are way down, but you're still paying rent based off of last year's income. I want to make sure that we empower staff to be able to sort of adjust on the fly. If there is extenuating circumstance, a tenant can prove, hey, my income this year is way lower than it was last year, but I'm still paying rent based off of last year's income, that staff feels empowered to be able to adjust. And that way a person isn't paying, their income suddenly cut by half or whatever, but they're paying rent based off of last year's income, which is double what they're currently
And
paying.
I think we
Does that
saw
make sense?
a very good example of this a few
During
years ago
COVID.
during COVID. And so, yes, absolutely. Staff and council should be very reactive should there be a major unforeseen circumstance.
And I think that that's best just left at staff level because things just take time and a bureaucracy at this level. I think staff is more able to quickly adjust should it be necessary.
I mean,
I'd like to see it come to council. If there's something that's related to the budget and subsidies, I think it needs to be brought to council.
For every individual family that has a change in their employment.
Well, if there's a recession or something of that nature, it's not gonna be one
I
family.
think Dan's talking about like a singular, someone.
Oh, if
I
it's
guess
singular-
both. I mean, both are worth examining, but I mean, yeah, but singular is probably more relevant for the staff.
Family.
I would trust staff to come and talk to us about if there's something that we need to get involved in.
Like if Telsky went under and like half of Shandoka lost their jobs, that would be something you would bring to us.
But, there's-
I don't know.
There's also very feasibly the circumstance, somebody, a business, a much smaller business closes, one person loses one really good, high-paying job, now is taken up serving work, whatever, making half as much money, but still makes every other requirement. I would want to accommodate that person.
I think I agree ethically more, I agree with you. However, just being a little bit more of a type A brain, is that problematic? Like when we have, a lease is a contract and we're signing contracts with people. And if we're not following the contract that we signed, that feels like kind of a legal issue.
Yeah, so in that situation, in the situation where just maybe 1 or 2 or 3 households are being impacted by an event,
They would still be bound by the contract to pay that rent. They could always break the lease and move out. However, were they to break the lease for the intent of getting a lower rent, because at renewal, we'll always calculate their income. Ideally, it always goes up. They might stay within the same tier. They might be moving up a tier at that point. If for some reason their income goes down, then we will reduce their rent to the appropriate tier so that it goes both ways.
But
If
when they
someone-
resign, not like.
If
midway
someone,
through.
yeah, if someone breaks a lease though with the intent to get a lower rent, we're still looking back at the previous 12 months of income.
Right.
So they'll need to, it won't take effect immediately. It's not, I lost my job, I don't want to pay rent. It's your actual income has to be reduced over a period of time to see that reduction in the rent amount.
Because otherwise, like, let's say somebody.
Interruption.
Oh,
The interpreter cannot hear you, so if you can please talk directly into your microphone.
Got it.
That would be great.
Well, and I think the other challenge with that is that we very specifically set the number of hours requirement to assume that there are 4 months out of the year that people aren't working. So there is a little bit of that safeguard. And I do believe that for any of us, like losing our job or an industry closure is tragic, but it is life. And I think there are other alternatives, maybe not preferred careers that could be accessed. And so my inclination is that if something like that was to occur for an individual family, that would be addressed at renewal, but it's not a decision that we would make on the fly based on a set of circumstances that our staff isn't going to be qualified to know that there are not additional jobs available.
I think it also just sets us up for if somebody, let's say you do lose that job and you lose it for 1 or 2 months and then you replace the job, is the expectation then that this person's going to come back to the housing authority and say, oh, by the way, now I got a higher paying job. Will you raise my rent again? I think that that's going to get us into a cycle of like, I think that the lease is the lease. And if you need assistance and other things, you can come and talk, but like, I don't think it's a break your lease, get a new lease, it's like, it seems like it's just gonna take us down a rabbit hole.
And their programs.
Exceptions for significant life events need to be taken into consideration.
Well, we have things in our community like the Good Neighbor Fund that are for
Mhm.
crisis issues like this to help cover rent.
Exactly.
That the Telluride Foundation executes. I'm pretty sure Tri-County Health has some similar programs too.
Still active.
Delaney.
So I appreciate what Councilperson Enright said about allowing staff discretion. I think we're talking about two very different things here. If there is an event that affects a majority of our population, that is something that I would hope we would all be having a discussion about. We already work with individuals when it is a individual situation, and I might have 8 households right now who are in their own individual situation, and we're working through that, and we work with them. With their current lease remaining intact, we help them navigate the Good Neighbor Fund. We find other resources. And so we already do that. And I'm hopeful that that discretion is still allowed when it's just an individual circumstance, even if it's a dozen households out of our 185 current units. I just wanted to clarify that we already do that. And if it ever does become a question of the lease and the contract and potentially not fulfilling that contract, I'm always in contact with our special counsel for housing to work through those situations. So just to clarify.
And you're comfortable doing it that way, to continue to do it that way.
Yes, and I think
And it's a low number. I mean, I don't want to bog us down on low percentages, and we're sympathetic to people whose jobs change, but you know, that's not going to matter whether you're in subsidized housing, not subsidized housing, whether you live in New York or Telluride or wherever. I mean, that's just a sad scenario, and it's great to hear that we're helping those people already. So I'm comfortable just keeping it the same way.
Okay. Do we feel like we have good direction on this upward mobility of existing tenants? Like letting staff use discretion to try and preserve as many of the lower income units with new projects?
So go to the, in the big green chart that has kind of all the qualification criteria, I already gave an example of what this could look like at Shandoka, for instance. So we had,
Sorry, which is this?
The big
it's the
green.
qualification by project.
It's the one that's horizontal.
Yes, it's an attachment to the memo. So under, so let's just look at Shandoka. So Shandoka, we had every proposed tier included at Shandoka. So you could be in tier A, you could be all the way up to tier F and still live in Shandoka. However, you'll see that underneath that, I said must qualify under tiers A through C, meaning in order to move into Shandoka, you have to earn under 100% AMI, but then you could move up to 200% or 250, whatever we set at the maximum over the course of your tenancy there. Is that something, is that where you want to draw that line, that 100% AMI? Do we want to draw it maybe at, tier D or tier E? Where should that line be drawn to be that barrier to entry of the maximum income to move in, understanding that once you're in, your income will be able to increase until you reach that maximum?
I like 100% for Shandoka. How does everybody else feel?
I think we set our maximum at 260, so I would probably say like 120 would be closer to the middle of that line.
Okay. Anybody else have input? I mean, are we talking about doing a different qualification tier range for each project?
We could. So one of the questions that we skipped over from the first bullet was what should the distribution be across projects? You haven't told us what tiers you would like to see at each project yet. For instance, we don't have a tier A at Sunnyside, mostly because we can't accommodate that level of rent at Sunnyside. We need the higher rents to meet those obligations. But if there are other projects you'd like to talk about, there's the other buildings at Shandoka, which are being remodeled or are going to be nicer. There's Virginia Placer. And then I know the boarding house is a little bit of an odd duck, but we could also talk about what you'd like to see there potentially.
I'd love to hear what your philosophy is on it. Do you have any input on that?
Based on prior conversations that we have heard from all of you, I think that having Shandoka entry levels be towards the lower end makes sense. Sunnyside is already kind of set and we just can't pencil it out to have A and B, tier A and B as presented in there. I think for the newest project coming online, Voodoo, due to other conversations, we want to see a wide spectrum. We want to see all of the levels addressed there. However, including the higher ends, just to make that project pencil out. So I guess philosophically and monetarily, I would suggest that perhaps and just because this term has been used a couple times now, that barrier for entry at Shandoka makes sense for sort of a mid-range, 120 or somewhere. For Voodoo, unless that's going to have a new name, which by the way, I've been asked that a lot this week, just putting that out there. Probably not having a barrier for entry until that project is live and we see how it works. And Virginia Placer and Sunnyside, I think that probably having, not Sunnyside, but maybe Virginia Placer, having some limit is okay, because that one's already decently established.
So Delaney, what do we need, like, to set, like, for us to cover our costs of O&M, and everything for Shandoka? How many, 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, et cetera, can we set at these different ranges? And then moving on to Virginia Placer and then Voodoo. I mean, like, that seems like the best starting point. And then we can move things around, like, but just to blanketly be like, oh, let's do this without having some sort of starting point of like, this is what we need to bring in to cover our costs, seems.
So this goes to an overarching question that I also did not hear consensus on, which is based on all of those tables that were provided to you, 22%, 25%, and 30% of the AMI targeted rent. We need to know if you have a preference for each property overall properties, what that target is, because that answer will answer the question you just asked me. I didn't hear consensus on that.
No, but I think what we did here was that you would be knowing that the AMI targets are set lower than even the lowest AMI to be within that tier. You could theoretically be comfortable with something up to 30%, but you'd like to fall maybe somewhere between 25 and 30 for our most expensive projects. And somewhere maybe a little lower than that for Shandoka. And we'll just have to crunch the numbers and see what makes sense.
I think for our new properties coming online, it makes sense for there not to be any barrier except for our limit that we've set. Because I think that the hope is that we want to be able, with our new projects, to give as much flexibility and movement within the system when we bring these new projects on. And so for that reason, I would say, I don't think we should have a lower barrier on these new projects, because we would want, we wouldn't want to say to a family in Shandoka or an individual in Shandoka, you've outgrown now a new nice project too. The same way that we don't want to exclude somebody at a lower end from being able to enter into a nice project as well. So I think in fairness for the new projects, and until we might feel that they've aged as to a certain amount, or there's other projects online or something, that I think that the new projects should be open to all of the tiers. That's my personal.
Yes. I mean,
Also,
that's the fundamental thing we're all trying to achieve here.
Yeah.
well, I think financially, because we do have a little bit of a question mark of how all the money's gonna fall here, I think giving us the opportunity to collect higher rents on the newer projects is smart. Just to make sure we're following through with our financial responsibilities with those.
But not to the extent that it would deny
Right.
others the
Yeah.
ability to live there.
Like just allowing the higher tier income earners to be able to enter into those projects, I think, and still going by, we haven't really talked about what the lottery for that looks like, but I know, I'm sorry. But yeah, I think it, for me, it kind of checks two boxes, because it also checks the box of fiscal responsibility on our end, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
What about allowing 220% as the max
But
getting into rental at new projects?
that is still just one of my primary concerns here, is that there is a very real possibility, depending on who wins those lotteries, especially for a new project like that it doesn't pencil out and requires additional subsidy from somewhere, which we haven't discussed where that somewhere is. And that's going to require additional subsidy from taxpayers, both within our housing system and outside of our housing system as well. And I really think that is a disservice, and it's not fulfilling our fiscal responsibility.
This goes back to what I was saying too, like with future projects, we're just like throwing out these numbers and these like charts that like, there's so many variables. It just seems,
I don't agree with that. What
You
we're
don't
going to
have
do
to.
is sit down with Lance and look at what we need, what numbers we need to hit in that project. And we are gonna have a certain amount of units that must be tier E, and a certain amount of units that must be tier D, et cetera. And then we're gonna pull everybody in the lottery, and whatever's left that they qualify for, they will be able to get, just like we do with our for sale projects. That's how I envision this. It's not gonna be like, just because the first 10 people drawn were tier A, they all get those units. We have already set up this bond. We have numbers that we need to hit, and we're not going to start off in the red.
I agree. We're going to be able to look at it and say, the whole point is we are saying we want to have a range of tiers within the projects. We also know that there are real world constraints that say we have to bring this much money in order to make this project work. So then what we're going to do is look at each of the units, all of the units together, and say, this is how many we are going to allocate at this tier. This is how many we're going to allocate at this tier. And then it's not going to be an exact number. There's going to be some fluctuation, because maybe it's 2 or 3 or whatever, but it will make sure that we hit that minimum. It's just a math problem. And I think that we can do that. I don't want to exclude people outright if we have the ability to include them.
I think that it's gonna be a success if in a 27 unit project, we're able to accommodate at least one or two tier A units in that project. Not saying it's supposed to be the majority.
Yes.
Just clarification, and we can go back to each of the questions at the end and re-clarify consensus. What I was hearing was that you do want a limit at Shandoka, but not at Virginia Placer, Sunnyside, or Voodoo.
I want to allow as much flexibility for staff to make it work. So yes,
And what would,
I agree with that.
what would that limit be at Shandoka? It'll help me when I create new tables for
Ashley threw out the 120% as a max.
I'm okay with
That was the max.
just for entry. You
Before, right?
can move up.
Right, you can move up.
That was roughly what the maximum was before, correct?
for currently.
I know it wasn't, yeah, thanks. And not like, I know we didn't measure it by AMI, but I think it would make sense to keep similar what our qualification is for Shandoka now. Whatever that translates to.
I think an easier number to utilize would be currently the median, taking out the highest and lowest three numbers for where they fall on the spectrum. The average, the median, AMI that we are serving there is 98%. So I think probably 120% is a good
Ceiling for entry.
Yeah.
That makes sense to me. That's the top of tier one. For our deed restricted
Mhm.
purchase program,
for the purchase. Yeah.
which is 80 to 120. So I think 120, that makes sense. Is that okay with everybody?
for me.
For Shandoka?
Just for entry.
Dan, do you have a,
I mean, I'm fine with it. it feels a little bit like we're just throwing numbers out a little bit right now. And I still maintain the concern that that will drag down over time, revenues. And that's an implication
That's
that's hard to
that's what the
bottom.
max is now and we're making. red.
Well, the max is now, that hasn't been
For
enforced.
entry.
For
it-
entry,
For
there-
entry,
it
it has
is.
been enforced.
Yeah.
You can't
Is that-
get
is that true?
into a
Okay.
Shandoka, unit if you make more than that right
Okay.
now.
I mean, I also think our goal, and we all agree that the goal is to move people through our housing system, get people to better. So we are hoping and working towards, as we build more units, especially moving people out of Shandoka and letting people get into that. So hopefully there is more movement through Shandoka in particular than there has been in recent history. So I think that will play out in the real world different than it has hypothetically, because how many unit turns in Shandoka have there been in the last couple of years?
There's been a lot this
Has there-
year,
has
more
there
than
been a lot?
we expected.
I mean,
Interesting.
I feel like what we learned earlier is that, and what we know is that up to 120% AMI at Shandoka at the rents, if they didn't go up, is successfully funding the project.
I mean,
And
yes. but-
so not upping that for entry would not risk.
But based off of the proposed tiers that is in our packet, some people will be paying less based off of that. And
Depends what per multiplier we choose.
yes, well, no, I think at all multipliers, all of the lower income,
A stays below at all of the A and
yes,
B, it looks like.
yes, which
stay
is what
below.
I'm saying. Sorry, I've got too many tabs open. I'm trying to find the right one now.
Even at 30% in Shandoka,
Okay,
B stays
yep.
below, which I'm okay with, because we're also balancing it with people who earn more money. I think that's the point of this, is finding the balance and helping people more who need more help.
Sorry, let me find those tables again.
But wouldn't we also be in a
Page
scenario?
2.
Sorry.
No, but it's just which tab.
I was just saying, but wouldn't we be in a scenario that similar to the past, that if there were red flags or we knew we were going super negative and having problems, you would bring it to us and we would adjust it? I mean, that's the whole point. And from, even though I'm new, seems like you've been doing a pretty good job with that. And we haven't had those crisis moments outside of, a pandemic or recession or things like that.
So just to clarify my point though, the proposed barrier for entry would be tier C, correct? That's 120.
Top end of D.
Top end of D, thank you.
It would be
As currently-
keeping it the same as it is now.
What would be keeping it the same?
The entry barrier.
The maximum income to qualify for.
Sure, but I'm more talking about revenues, about rents generated
Oh,
here.
okay, yeah.
Because you'd have two tiers, at least A and B, that are generating less revenue in every circumstance. Tier C is generating less revenue in in about 50% of the circumstances based off the tiers. It depends on whether we go at 25 or 30%. I'm looking at those two tables for Shandoka here. So yeah, I am just foreseeing, it's not certain, but it is a possibility that if with that barrier to entry at 120, Shandoka in particular generates less revenue overall, and we have a less consistent revenue stream.
I
with
just
that.
really don't think that's gonna happen with the amount of people who are above income, and I thought you'd be excited that some people's rents are going
I'm not saying I'm not.
based on the
I-
arguments up to this
But
point.
my whole philosophy, again, my whole argument is keep this as an enterprise fund, keep these as cost neutral enterprises. Put people who earn more in the more costly projects, like the new projects.
But how, if we did that, so let's say we did that. Let's say we said the maximum that you can make to live in Shandoka is 120% AMI. And then you can't live in Shandoka if you make more than 120% AMI, you have to move into one of these new projects. Shandoka would not be solvent at that point.
No, that's not true. That because it's still generating the exact amount of revenue it currently is, which is solvent and then some by a factor of 4.
Not if you just said that the tiers A's and B's, their rents are going down. And a lot of times, depending on if we do 20, 25 or 30, up to C and D, their rents are going down. So based on this new tiered system, if we put those limits on the unit, how is it that Shandoka would be able to generate the same amount of funds if all it was housing is tiered A, B, C, maybe D?
I mean, I'm not 4 tiers, actually. That's not what we're talking, that's not what I'm talking about. I don't want tiers, as I have been very clear about.
So I guess my point is that the group consensus is that we want to do tiers.
Uh-huh.
So now you have to operate within that framework. So operating within that framework, we need to have the higher tiers in all of the projects because because the rents will be coming down.
That's how you, I mean, to get to the average, I mean, I think to like what you just said, like, I mean, having everything as an enterprise fund, to me, when we look to the long term of this program is problematic. And that's why I want to see the program overall work as opposed to each building being self-sustaining. But I think right now, again, what we keep saying is like, these are living, breathing documents and policies that we are going to implement. And I think for the next 2 years, I don't have a fundamental concern about setting that target at 120%, especially given the fact that that's what it has been currently. And
That's
Maximum.
disconnected
Well,
from
maximum,
rents.
sorry,
though.
maximum, I
wait.
apologize.
That's disconnected from rents.
I-
Go ahead.
I think, so Delaney just told us that the median income in Shandoka is 98% AMI.
That's
Right.
currently
Or
being
the mean,
served,
the median or the mean?
the median,
The median.
so half
So
below. half-
Okay.
half above, yeah.
I think it would be helpful to know what the mean is.
The
'cause-
average.
Yeah, like the actual average
92%,
is what?
92%.
Okay, so if the average income in Shandoka is tier C, right? And we're looking at all the tier C incomes, which are fairly, depending on what rent we go to, but are equal to or a little bit higher, or a little bit lower, but on average about the same what we're currently charging. If the average is at that level, then that means mathematically we're collecting about the same money, right? If that's the
I'm not a
math of it.
mathematician, but
But again, we're talking about multiple things at the same time. My point is with the new lower, or with the maintaining that lower barrier to entry, 120, the people coming into it will not be
The 92% is who's currently in Shandoka based on the proposed barrier that we're talking about, because that's also the current barrier.
Sure.
So what we're seeing in practice in Shandoka is the evidence we have for what this income barrier would be moving forward, because it's the same. We're not changing
I
it.
mean, my point is more that there is so many variables within this. There is a set of circumstances that could arise. That is not guaranteed, but it is very feasible to be possible. That the new tenants that move in are in those lower tiers.
Which is what we want.
Yeah, I mean, but
Don't forget.
Right.
it,
That's our goal here.
and when I say lower tiers, I mean A and B specifically,
Yep, that's what we want.
that are generating less revenue.
Yep, that's what,
Okay,
that's the
we got
goal
it,
of our
we got it,
program.
We got it. Just be nice.
I agree with Jesse. I don't appreciate that though, please. So
Go ahead.
I'm just saying, again, I know I'm repeating myself, so I can leave it here. I don't think that that is necessarily financially responsible.
We
I
have
would
confidence.
say that also, like Geneva references when she first moved here and there were empty units in Shandoka. Like Shandoka was able to
And we had,
exist with empty units as well. So like there could be a future where we have enough housing that some units sit empty.
we also had a much larger supply of free market rentals.
No, but what I'm saying
it
is that
just don't exist.
Shandoka could survive even with empty units. Like there's a hypothetical future if we're talking about like hypothetical situations. There's also the possibility that we could have empty units that aren't generating income. I think there's like a million hypotheticals that we could throw out there, but what we have is the data of the existing project, and that's what we're basing this off of. Like, I don't think we should adjust these numbers based on hypothetical situations. Again, what if the ski resort closes? Like, that's a hypothetical situation, but what we have is the current data to look at.
And what it comes down to me is I trust the staff to sound the alarm if we're going down the wrong path, no matter what policies we set. And we can't just start coming up with 15 different hypotheticals to try to figure out how to thread the needle to solve the problem, or we're never going to solve it. We need to try to come up with a decision that we think helps the most people, and then just be ready to reanalyze it at times, adjust it, and take the advice of our staff who are doing this work every single day to say, hey, guys and girls, we're doing it wrong. We may need to think about doing X, Y, or Z and do it that way, because we're never going to be perfect, and we're not supposed to be perfect.
I mean, I remember very clearly Ashley saying pretty recently, although I forget exactly what it was in regards to. But Ashley said very clearly of these are people's lives, and not considering some of these hypotheticals. This was in regards to another topic. It wasn't in regards to this one, but I remember you saying of assessing these hypotheticals is part of our job and what we're here to do, because we are making decisions that very clearly impact people's lives. So it would be a disservice not to take time to consider some of those. We don't have to keep going around on this topic, but I think that assessing hypotheticals is part of what we're here to do.
Well, certainly from a staff standpoint, it's, we hear loud and clear, you want tiers. I think what's challenging right now in the midst of the conversation is just to be able to play out all the implications, and we can take a little bit more time to do some math on that, if you will. But I think the general direction is good, but it's going to take us a minute to provide all the implications, if you will, on various scenarios.
I just wanted to put it in perspective because I feel like it's been lost a little bit. I mean, Lance mentioned the debt service number on Shandoka, and that's the one you seem to be focused on. 25%, a little under 25% is the debt service ratio right now. That's very favorable for a public housing project. There are jurisdictions that would love to have a debt service number that low. You're not 50%, you're not 75%, you're not even approaching 100%. Where some projects are right at 100%, where whatever they're bringing in, they're paying the debt service on that. You're very lucky with all of these programs, and the debt you have is not that substantial. We're not going to be in a situation, even if we have a number of units go into an A and B tier, where that number is going to change significantly. I understand you're concerned about it, and you should be, and making sure that you have that fiscal responsibility intact. You do at 22-23% of debt service ratio, very favorable.
I think that's a great
Good point.
point. I think it's a good pivot point to try and move on to the next question. I think we have consensus, maybe not with all, but majority to fix the 120% as the maximum income to qualify for Shandoka and a much broader range for the other projects, and that we can let staff figure out what will make Voodoo pencil, and we will be discussing that at a future THA subcommittee meetings.
Very
Right.
soon.
Very
I hope.
soon, which is very exciting. Our next question is, I've got the wrong packet open.
So the so the last two questions, we're gonna just skip ahead for a second. We think those questions have already been answered by the other conversations that have occurred. Should tenants with lower income tiers have their rent lowered? We presume that the answer to that is yes. And that even is in effect with the 30% target rent. We can still come back with 27. Maybe we can circle back to hear clearly what you want for the next option on your plate. And should those tenants pay the same current rent and have no rent increases until the AMI target is reached? I feel like we have answers to those questions based on earlier conversation. Should newly renovated units at Shandoka be considered for using the 25% factor versus 22%? It doesn't sound, from what we've heard, like 22% is where direction we're taking anyway. So somewhere between 25 and 30, and maybe we can get a more clear number before the end of this meeting. So going back up to how will income be calculated? As I said earlier, currently we're asking for tax returns because that seems like the most logical way to get income information from folks. But what we are finding out is that they have other income sources that aren't
Can you give
That-
some examples?
child support, alimony, gifts from family, things that are actually asked on the deed restricted application forms for sources of income. When we do implementation, we have other issues with our application that are just confusing that we want to amend, but I didn't want to go down that road and just do one big amendment instead of 5 little ones. So how will it be calculated? And the staff recommendation is to follow the guidelines as closely as possible. It's less confusing for staff and the public if we try to keep those things done in a similar fashion.
I like the concept. Does that mean we would be asking for child support, alimony, all of that stuff for rental projects?
I would prefer to ask for that because a real life situation that came up recently is I was deeply concerned about someone being able to actually afford their current rent because of their stated income. And they said, no, we're fine. And I said, how? How are you fine? Like, do we need to find you food assistance? What do we need to do to help your household? Oh, I make this much more because I get help from child support / alimony. Okay, well, I breathed a sigh of relief because then I realized that they were okay. Without knowing what a person's true income sources are, it could create a host of other concerns in our department as the community services department. I just think that all income should be considered. We already talked about the piece, I believe it was done and dusted on having the similar deductions allowed for medical, student loans,
Retirement savings.
Retirement.
yeah, so please
Uh,
discuss.
I think there's a, with things that aren't taxable, I think using tax returns are good, but I think that there's a fine line between asking for certain pieces of information, like things that violate, let's say like HIPAA, receipts for payment on medical bills. I think that we need to be very sensitive to that, like, especially when things end up penciling out right to someone's tax returns. So
But they get to choose whether they want to ask for a deduction and turn in their expenses.
yeah,
medical
but I think as
bills.
far as staffing goes, let's be sensitive to exactly what they're asking for, like not medical information.
Well, I think that that's a personal choice. If somebody wants to submit it because they would like a lower rent, that is acceptable. That is their personal choice, and that's not for us to govern. I think when we're looking at alimony, child support, that is a court order, that is a public document, like that is fine.
Yeah, and the deduction also isn't for medical expenses, it's contributions to a HSA account. So we're not looking at whether you paid a doctor's bill and what it was for, that's not what we're analyzing. We're analyzing whether you're saving money like
I
in a
know what an
retirement
HSA
account, and that's where the deduction to income can come into play.
I like the idea of keeping it consistent.
I do too.
Yep.
Mhm.
I like keeping it simple.
Okay.
With alimony and like child support, they would have to bring in like the court order, correct?
So if they want to, but we're hopeful that we would like people to just self-state honestly without us having to dig. That we don't want people's personal information. People overshare as it is, and I'm constantly saying, please don't tell me this. I'm your landlady. I don't want to know that. So we're hopeful that people will self-state if it's a small town.
Sure.
If we believe that there is income not being stated, then we may ask for something further. Above all, we want to provide housing to the people who need it the most, who can't find other resources for housing. And it's going to help us do that the more honest people are. And so anybody who is out there listening right now on Kodo, that's it. We're not trying to dig. We're just trying to make it as equitable for everyone as possible. And we need honesty for that, but we do not want additional information if we don't need it.
Yeah, just like with the guidelines enforcement, we start with sworn statements. So there's pretty simple paperwork that you fill out, just saying, how much did you earn? We do ask for tax returns there that have to be submitted with your compliance paperwork. But for all other sources of income, we're not necessarily asking for proof of that income unless and until we hear otherwise and need to instigate an investigation. And that's when we'll ask for documentation that supports everything that you already submitted to us. And when it shows that it's not truthful, accurate, and complete, that's when there's a problem. So it really is in everyone's best interest to be truthful upfront. And even if there is some kind of violation, just like with the guidelines program, that's when we'll work with you to fix the violation and keep you in your current housing. But it all starts with having accurate and complete disclosures and documentation. But we don't ask that you submit full documentation to support, every representation that you're making. We don't have time to review 200 pages for each person who lives in rental housing. We don't want to review it. So we'll start with what you tell us. And from there, if we hear otherwise, that's when we might dig a little deeper and ask for other documentation.
Delaney, in the example that you were highlighting there with the person that you feared they were under income and wouldn't make it, how will that example be affected once an earned income standard is applied?
So all I can give you is an example from RHA from long ago, and I don't know if legal will hold the same opinion on this. So in the case of alimony and child support, we'll just use that one. Both individuals are still living in the area. Both of them still work in the area. They may even both still live in town-owned housing. So they have to qualify. The income earned that is being paid for child support and alimony is actually earned here. And in the past, that's how it had been looked at, that it is actually meeting the earned income standard because it's all being earned here. Now, if that situation is different, I don't know. That's more of an implementation piece that we're going to need to discuss once you have a draft document and it looks good, then we got to figure out the implementation piece.
I got thoughts, but we can cross that bridge later. It sounds like you want to do that later, so that's fine.
Yeah, and I wrote a question down I have for Ally about the medical stuff too, so for future discussion. Since we are at 5 minutes to 11, personally, I would love to go back to the top of the questions and just get some, make sure we have very explicit and clear direction. Because I believe we're still aiming for a draft document for the June 25th meeting, which is 12 days away. Yes?
Yes. Okay. With regard to the multiplier, I feel comfortable totally crossing off the 22% option. Does everybody else agree with that? Especially with the large distance between tier income and AMI targeting within that tier. I was comfortable with sticking with 30% because it by policy through the program, most people are that. It's very, or at least 25% because at the base of your tier, the AMI targeting is 5% below. So in effect, we're using 25% multiplier. Does everybody agree with that concept?
I don't know if that maths, but I agree with the concept that you're saying.
So like in the tiers that are proposed,
Yeah, I don't know if 5% below the targeted income equates to 25% of your,
of the multiplier.
yeah, like, I don't know if
Okay.
that maths, but I agree with what
But
you're
it's
saying.
less
Yeah.
than the multiplier. And we could figure out what that number is. I think maybe we address that on the next meeting, when we start seeing some larger charts. Do we want to go on to the next topic?
So just to be clear, I just would like consensus so that we know how to move forward. I guess I would also point you back to the attachment that has the 3 different tables specifically for Shandoka. If 30% is used as the target, everyone in tier A, their rent will be lower than it currently is. A portion of, not everyone, but a portion of the people in tier B will also recognize lower rent in the larger units, 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. They will also have lower rent. So you're looking right around in between the B and C tier categories. That's the soonest you would see any rent increases. And that's using the 30% multiplier. And I understand and appreciate the comments that were received from Kathy about using 22% to help protect the lowest, most in need AMI. But I think that even at 30%, that is occurring. If you would like to see, just for fun, the 27%, we can bring back 2 options, 27% and 30%, or whatever number you give us.
I love looking at that stuff, so if it's not too much trouble, I would love to see it 27 and 30%. My inclination right now is that 30% is working and we are adjusting down rents for the folks who need it to be adjusted down. But I'm just wondering.
My only holdup with that is I do like the idea of having a lower multiplier for the older Shandoka units. And if we start Shandoka at 30%, we're not gonna go above 30% for our other units, so it doesn't give anyone any kind of like rent break for living in an older building. So that was my only reason for advocating for Shandoka, is just acknowledging that those are not as nice of units.
I think 27 is
Let's look at the 27, yeah.
a good
Agree with that.
compromise.
I also want to acknowledge that tier C is below the area median income. So these are everything in tier C or below is people in the bottom half of our income earners in the Telluride region. And so yeah, I mean, you know my thoughts, but I think that it's tough to tell a lot of people the majority of people in B or not the majority, at least some of the people in B and all of the people in C that we're increasing their rent and providing no additional advancement opportunities and no avenue to build equity is a disservice to the constituents of Telluride.
I mean, I could get on, I like 25% at Shandoka and 30% on the other projects is something I could get on board with, but I don't know how everyone else feels.
I think we need to see how it all pencils.
Yeah.
So let's look at or should we do 27.5? So it's exactly in the middle.
Just do 27.
Just 27? Okay, great.
I mean, it's just
Let's
an
take a look at
extra-
27%, see how that affects the tiers, especially once we've expanded the tiers. And talk about that at the next meeting.
And for the other properties, maintain 30, or do you also want to see?
I think the other properties have to
Okay.
maintain 30.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what we also heard was to rework the tier structure to go up to, thank you, 260%, because you want those 20% steps put
Yep.
into place. We did not necessarily, this ties into the second to last question about the barrier for entry piece, but distribution across the projects. Do you want all tiers at all?
I think we need to maintain
Projects.
flexibility based on the project. So I don't think we should write that in. I think we have to take that project by project.
So for now, just presume that all tiers are available at all projects,
Yes.
but with the barrier for entry at 120% only for Shandoka.
Yes.
Okay, and then the upper limit is 260%.
On all projects, correct?
You,
Okay.
you had mentioned 220 for the upper limit for other projects?
I think 260 makes more sense
Okay.
for now because of the unrelated roommate situation. And as a way to sort of like provide more room for them.
And then everyone, or the majority at least, was keep consistent with the income
Yes.
calculation. Okay, great.
There was one thing that I wanted to mention before we move on, is noticing that like a 2-bedroom, 1-bath in Shandoka costs the same as a 2-bedroom, 2-bath with a loft.
So they don't. Right now,
Well, yeah, but in the proposed, they do.
that was based on the model. Thank you for asking that question. This is based on the model of 1 person per bedroom, 1 person for a 1-bedroom, 2 people for a 2-bedroom. Even if that 2-bedroom is in a different building that currently has a higher rent because of when it was built. The G&H building is the newest building. The rents in those units are a little higher overall than the rents at A through E buildings, and F has some of both. They're either even or above. A through E. And then the units that have the lofts, it's just done by bedroom size. If there is a way to create a nuance for those units that have a little bit of extra space, I'm happy to work through those numbers as well. I don't know if we have an accelerated rent based on the square footage, and if that is something that gets written into the policy, that if the unit has additional square footage, i.e. a loft, that there is a 10% increase in the base cost or 15% or whatever that looks like. I can present that too.
I think the extra bathroom too, that's like where that feels like a significantly nicer unit that could potentially house more a larger household. I don't know what the solution is, but it did pop out as something that was worth a discussion.
Thank you for bringing that up.
I would lean on staff to, given the framework that we've discussed today, make some appropriate adjustments between these unit sizes and present them to us. I really don't want us to spend 3 hours
Great.
here
Yeah.
debating what the square footage addition would be. I think that if you present something to us that is in the same philosophy as what was there before, I think that's great.
And I was going to, but I appreciate that it was asked outright.
Great.
I think we're through the tiers section. And Ally, would you like to address this one?
Yes.
I need to run to the restrooms. I'll be back.
So the next 2 topics we have are the reserved unit policies and then finishing up with the pet policies that Dan had requested back a couple of meetings ago that we just bring up and discuss. With respect to the reserved unit policies, there's really 2 situations where this comes up. So first is with master leases that we have with businesses. It's my understanding that that used to be a much more common practice. And according to Delaney, there's only 2 units that we have that are under what we call a master lease right now, which is a lease with a business who then gets to choose their own occupants. So, but we don't do a sublease for those occupants. So for Delaney's purposes, the problems with that is we don't know who's in there. They're not necessarily qualified by us to be in there. We essentially, we just lease the unit to the business. So there are 2 units that are subject to that master lease right now. 2 units for one business, and I believe it's 5 bedrooms total. So as I said, I think this was a more common practice in the past. We've phased it out a little bit. But I didn't know if that was something that you wanted to bring up to maybe incorporate now into this written policy and say, we would like to accommodate this, or we would specifically like to not further this practice. If we are going to continue this practice, I just think that we do need more regulations about actually having a formal sublease. The people in there do need to actually qualify. So those are the discussions I'd like to have about that part of this policy. The second part of the reserved unit policy is also what the town does with some of the units. So the town, either as a recruitment tool or to retain employees that find themselves unhoused, will take units that are available and give those to a town employee. At some properties, the town employee does need to qualify. At other properties, some of those qualification criteria might be flexed to allow that employee to live at that property. So there's really 2 ways in which units more or less skipped the wait list. And that's for businesses that we have a master lease. And then of course, the town using these units for town employees. With respect to the town employee leases, I think it's important to keep in mind that these leases are always contingent upon continued employment with the town. So it's not that an employee gets a town unit and then can quit their job or separate from employment and then retain their housing. They will lose their housing if they do separate their employment with the town. But it is a way for the town to use these properties that we have constructed and brought about for town employees who we know are local, we know they're working local, we know they're meeting the hours requirements. There might not be other opportunities for housing for those employees. So those are 2 policies that we just need to hash out today and discuss a little bit further and see what we want the parameters to be around those policies if we are going to continue them.
Let's start with the town one since you just finished going over it. What are folks' feedback about that?
I think the town policies are working.
I couldn't hear you, sorry.
I said, I think they're working. The policies that we have in existence are working.
Yeah, having some more flex units that the town can utilize in a pinch makes sense to me. We don't have, how many units are like this?
So the town right now has ultimate discretion with respect to all of the units. Of course, with that discretion, we try not to over-exercise it. And the manager might have a little more to add here too. Retaining discretion for the town to be able to use these units for town employees is as I said, but pretty vital recruitment tool. When we're bringing in qualified employees from outside of the area to fill a vital role here, and there just isn't any other housing available. Sometimes that's a temporary landing pad and just to give them time to get them here to fill the role. And then in the coming months or the next year, they are looking for alternate housing. Maybe their family hasn't even joined them yet. So they're looking, for housing to have their family be able to join them. So it's more or less a landing pad for some employees. Other employees, it might be a long-term housing situation.
And Ally, just to clarify, this is around I believe the number's about 17 that are town-built and town-dedicated units. Is that right in the ballpark? We certainly have other employees that live in town and have gained that housing in different ways, but I think the ones that we are.
So there are
primarily focused
no
on are those.
dedicated units. The only we have some dedicated on-call units. Sunnyside is the only property that has dedicated units that we talked about before the lottery even went live. So
For
you might
rental,
remember,
rental,
yes,
yeah,
for
that-
rental.
some-
Yeah.
We do get a lot of the ownership versus rental.
Yeah,
confusion
so for
sometimes.
rental purposes, there's 2 at Sunnyside specifically for town employee use, and there's 2 at Sunnyside specifically for county use. And that was part of the land deal with Sunnyside and the county. For the other properties, so let's just take Shandoka, for instance. And I tried to break this out in the staff memo. So 2 units at Shandoka are formally reserved for on-call units for use by TMO staff. We're not signing leases with TMO staff. Those units are just kept empty for that purpose if they need to be used overnight as an on-call unit. Other units can be prioritized as needed. And there's 10 town employees who have currently been prioritized to live at Shandoka. The town's practice with respect to Shandoka specifically, though, has been that if we're going to prioritize you as a town employee for Shandoka and let you skip the wait list, you have to qualify for Shandoka. So you can't make over the income limit. You have to meet all other criteria, hours. So it's the only benefit you're getting by being a town employee is getting to skip the wait list at Shandoka. All other criteria apply. That's not necessarily true for the other properties, and you'll see that I put down for Virginia Placer. Similarly, we do have 2 units that are dedicated as on-call units. We're not signing leases with employees for those units. But other units similarly can be prioritized as needed. However, at Virginia Placer, we have not typically required employees to qualify for Virginia Placer. We do have some higher earners at Virginia Placer that under the current policies would not qualify. However, moving forward, they would.
It
So,
sounds
but.
like with the new tier process, everybody's gonna qualify,
Mhm.
right?
Yes.
And maybe the on-call units are in their own category because people don't live there.
Mhm.
They're just using it for overnight, and we've decided that we need those units for that.
But with Virginia Placer, remember that you did want to implement that 12-month work history requirement. So that's one area where if we're recruiting for a higher earning position from outside of the area, we can't fill that with someone who's already local. That would be a flexed criteria in order to sign a lease with someone to move into Virginia Placer.
And these are oftentimes snowplow drivers, equipment operators, deputy marshals, things along those lines where truly a presence required is quite important.
My quick question is, I agree with me and I think it's working well, but I just want to make sure the town isn't taking more than we need. I don't think we are, but I just want to confirm that the on-call units especially are not sitting empty the majority of the time, correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. That's it's mostly even just for the listening public, because sometimes that accusation gets levied against the town that we self-deal and treat ourselves,
Yeah.
I
better.
mean,
Particularly during, there's certainly some ebb and flow on a seasonal basis, but yeah, for the great majority of time, these are occupied, and particularly during winter months,
Sure.
having an on-call snowplow driver or wastewater treatment plant operators critical to our operations.
I think my main question having to do with this, I agree that it's working well. I think it's just the skip the wait list thing that we are addressing the wait list and trying to make it be more predictable. And I just want to make sure that if a town employee gets to skip the wait list to get into Shandoka, that then we are checking that off as one of the approach units towards our 30% goal.
yes, for sure.
Okay.
Shifting it to master leases for businesses, if we're all okay with that, because I think that is a separate topic. I'm less supportive of it. I could kind of go either way on it. I feel that it empowers the workers more to be the ones on the lease and have that control of that. And I certainly know there are circumstances where you feel trapped in both your housing and your work situation because they're tied together. And if there is a circumstance at your work where you don't get along with your boss, or there's some systemic abuse or what have you, you don't feel as empowered to leave that job because your housing is tied to your employment. And so I think my gut reaction is that I would prefer to get rid of master leases. We keep the same tenants that are currently in there and just qualify them through our process. And so there's no turnover there, and we get rid of the concept for master leases for businesses.
I am in favor of master leases. I think everybody knows that. I do think that the process needs to be refined. I do think that the tenants that are living in those units that are a master lease do need to qualify and fill out paperwork with the town specifically so that they are, so that information is tracked. But I think that it's a really vital need in this community right now. I mean, Mountain Village is also implementing some master lease units as well because our businesses are suffering. And ultimately, if we like really go high level on these units, like we really are trying to keep our economy. You know, with this being housing that is for our workforce specifically. And so I don't think that all units should be master leases, of course, but I do think that we should be setting aside master lease units for businesses located in the town of Telluride.
Ashley.
I don't think I like master leases.
Yeah.
I think that the whole point of this housing is that it is for all employees that work in the area. It seems selective to me that, because here's the reality. How do we make a determination of which business gets to have a master lease and which one doesn't? That seems unfair to me. I think that it should be based on an individual's, qualifications. I don't think that businesses should be allowed to utilize this, and because it ultimately gives specific businesses an advantage over another. So I can't see a benefit of a master lease other than to those specific businesses. I'm open to hearing people's defense of them, but I just, as a business owner that houses their full-time staff, I don't get a benefit of having a place in Shandoka. I also don't get the offset of what my business does for my employees, and I would never expect that. I don't think that it's appropriate. So my initial inclination is no.
Before I can chime in, I'm trying to figure out what the process is for a business. Like, okay, there are two businesses on there now. I don't think, how did they get there? And
What's the nature? I feel like we need to understand what the nature of those businesses
right,
is.
well, and part of that also is I think it's a slippery slope of trying to determine who's really essential and who's not, and also not being somewhat conflicted with having town master leases and saying we can't have it for other businesses because we have it and you can't. So I have to be sensitive to that. But I'm trying to figure out before I decide, my opinion, what's the demand currently from local businesses to say, I need this? And then two, how does it work for selection based with them getting units versus the general public getting units, separate lists? I just don't know.
I don't know what the demand is because I haven't had any inquiries lately. I think that the business industry here knows that we don't really have them. The two that are currently in place are holdovers from at least 20 years ago. We used to have 5, and by change of ownership at a couple of businesses, those just went away. These 2 are the remainder of when those were put into place. There, as far as I have gone back in the files to look, I cannot find any official, here, we're gonna do this. I think that the town was, or whoever was managing the property at the time, was approached and they said, oh, sure, because there was availability. Thank you, Ashley, because I started to write questions down. If we do go in that direction, how we do that. Here's a teaser. It is probably not going to be ready for prime time at the June 25th meeting, but I have in all of my data collection, when people fill out their employment certifications, it says where they work, and I am tracking where everybody works. And I cannot think of a single industry that is not being represented in our town-owned rental properties currently. And in fact, some business owners, just for luck of who they hired, I guess, are really doing pretty well with who's being housed in town-owned rental.
I thought if I could add just a quick note, certainly during, to Delaney's point, the town hasn't issued master leases for quite a few years. It's a bit of a holdover from old policies and needs, I suspect. We have, if you recall, however, discussed master leases in the context of Virginia Placer 2, that unbuilt but designed project on Black Bear Road, that we've been approached by a number of our special taxing districts around. And that has been an area that staff has received some direction in the past. Maybe that will change, but we've certainly received some direction to look at that through the VP2, Virginia Placer 2, through the lens of potentially master leasing that specifically to special tax districts such as uh, the medical district, the library district, the fire district, and others. I think there are 8 taxing special districts within the town of Telluride, and we have discussed at some length creating a model to allow them to apply for and potentially get master leases in, I believe it's, let's call it roughly 10 units of VP2. And again, the reasoning behind that is that some of those districts really don't have the ability to build their own, some do, but they all, to differing degrees, provide various health and welfare services that maybe some private businesses don't. But that's philosophically where we've been over the last number of months, and we're not locked in there, but that's the one other master leasing discussion that's been out in front of us. Ashley?
I mean, I think that there is a very vast difference between a organization that is a special taxing district that has the ability to go out and get public funds and taxing versus a private entity and enterprise, like as a private business. So I think that you can hold those two ideas and say these special taxing districts, especially if they're getting funds to help us construct this housing for them, whatnot, that is different than a private business being able to carve out housing for their individual business. I just think that I do appreciate that you brought it up, Scott, and I think that I could sit here and say, I can totally support us having partnerships with special taxing districts and working with them to build housing and provide housing for those types of services versus creating master leases for specific businesses, because it's not going to be a situation where every business is going to have the opportunity to get one.
Let's hear from this side of the room.
I just want to echo what Dan and Ashley said in regards to no master leases. I both, and just want to like reiterate the fact that this is like public subsidized affordable housing, and it should be treated as such. And the more that we talk about master leases, with the exception to Ashley's point of some of these special districts, emergency service providers, it needs to remain that way, it's teetering to like more privatized business, and I don't like that whatsoever.
What is the nature of the businesses that have these master leases? I feel like that's just a big
I mean,
elephant in the room.
it's the restaurant industry.
Okay. Okay.
I think that's vague enough, right? Yeah.
And it's one business that has 2.
Okay,
says.
that seems,
Yeah.
and we're all about equity, and that seems like it's not equitable. As someone who's owned a restaurant in town who did not get housing. The thing about the special tax, if we're gonna talk about the taxing districts, I do have a little bit of a hesitancy because a lot of these special taxing districts got taxes passed with the promise that they would use them for housing. So for them to kind of double dip into the taxpayers' pockets, I think is a little problematic. And I have issue with how they're using some of that money that they collected.
I think that, I mean, that ultimately is the conversation, is it has to be sort of what's good for the goose is good for the gander. If we have entities in this area that have been able to raise money, tax our people to build housing, it's an advantage that our restaurants, our retail operations do not have. And so, truly, ultimately, I do believe that the success, and I think we can look to some other peer communities as well that do have programs like this, and maybe that would help inform this conversation a little bit more if we could get a little bit of research. And honestly, this does not have to be part of this policy for now. I think this is something that we would need to implement over a number of years. But I think there's plenty of businesses that would say, I would give money if that meant that I could guarantee that I had staff, just the same way that a taxing district would as well. And I don't, and I very much feel that if we are looking at equity, we cannot say that one particular role or one particular service is is more important than another, especially coming off of a few years when everybody was deemed essential, essentially in this community. And so I would like us to revisit this conversation with a little bit more data and to look at what our peer communities are doing, because I think that that would be hugely informative for everyone.
Just a quick reply, because I hear your concern, Elena, but I just don't, on the concept of double dipping for these special taxing interests, but I don't know that they are. Because in the way I'm conceiving it is these taxing districts are covering their expenses, covering their half of the project that then is then allocated to them. And that there would be no further subsidy from.
But then is it a master lease or do they just own those units?
It would be, well, again, we've
Depends on how we
conceptualized it as a
structure.
master lease in past discussions, not necessarily an ownership. It can be crafted in a lot of ways. We know some other ski towns recently who have gone very in depth into selling
Unit.
town constructed units to, let's call it, restaurants, hotels, to help ensure that those employees are in their town. Might not fit well for Telluride and our philosophies, but that is the route some others have gone. What we've talked about philosophically here with Virginia Placer 2 was most likely more of a rental product that would not be subsidized. I think we've been pretty clear from the start. If it costs X to build and X to operate, that's the straight financial charge we would make to them. There's certainly, it seems like limited cause for the town to then be subsidizing even a tax district's rental of those products. But I think we have primarily looked at those through the rental lens, not ownership.
Let's hear from Teddy, and then I have an idea of how we can wrap this up and move on.
Yeah, I just want to say quickly, there's just too much to think about to make a decision, and I agree with me in that if we can pull this out of what we're trying to move forward with, we can address this at a later time, because it's just a couple quick points. I know that in the region, most of the deed restrictions for purchase are tightening up, where they don't want the businesses to own and then rent. They want more owner occupied. So it seems that we want to trend away from that as a community. And I'm very concerned about the inequity. Like, you win the lottery and you get to put your employees in, and that might mean your business has a better chance to survive against another business. Might be playing God a little bit. And then what's the holistic vision, and do we need to be creating projects down the road that do solve this need and come up with a more equitable distribution of them? We decide, but I think it's way too complicated for us to figure this out in the next 5 minutes.
So I think we all agree we don't like the couple master leases that exist as they do, and we would like to transition those units back to the way that we're gonna run all of our projects. Maybe we have some appetite for some kind of master lease program or working with businesses, but it should be not integrated and sprinkled amongst our rental. That's what I'm hearing the majority of folks say. Does anybody disagree with that?
I'm just, at this point, I could be swayed at some point, not in favor of the master lease thing at all.
That's what I'm saying, is that we take master leases out of our rental program now, and then moving forward in programs like, in projects like Virginia Placer 2, or maybe some other project that we come up with in the future, we give not some, grandfathered in program, but like come up with a new way of how we want to engage and work with local businesses for future projects. But for our rental projects, overall, we do not have master leases. That's sort of what I was hearing. You don't think that's
What I was hearing from at least Councilperson Fee and Mayor Errico is that they wanted to pull this out of the discussion of the policies and not even include it in this iteration. That's what I was hearing.
We don't have a waiting list. There doesn't seem to be a big demand for it right now, although it may be there. We just
I
haven't
mean,
asked for it.
I'm seeing the straw poll was
I think
5 of us
every
don't want
business would
master
love
leases.
master lease.
And me and Teddy
Thank
are
you.
open to some kind of master lease, but I think that the rest of us might be open to discussing that in the future, but not the ones that exist
Right.
currently.
So consensus is to actually, in the policies, say no master leases
Right.
and transition the remaining two.
I think that that's where our consensus is.
And I'd like to see if we could just gather that data and have it for a future discussion for these policies as they evolve. Because I have actually been approached by like
Right.
probably more than 10 businesses about this.
Well, because every business would love this.
Yeah.
No, of course they
I think
would.
I think it also gives the
But of
businesses
course.
too much power and not the citizens. And we're trying to empower citizens, and this is like not what this program
The
is. for.
businesses are getting the
I
benefit
agree.
because we have a requirement that they work in the town. So the businesses in the town are already getting the benefit.
In the region,
We sh-
we have a policy
Okay.
that they work in the
The region, but so what I'm saying is like, then to give, we're already giving those, it already benefits the businesses. To me, then to single out specific businesses, because we are not gonna be able to do it for every business. It gives them it gives them a leg up over other businesses, and we're just not gonna be able to satisfy it, and I don't know if we wanna start
I just
just
think
going there.
this is all a debate for another
Yes,
day,
agreed.
and we don't
Absolutely.
want master leases in our rental program right now.
And I want to clarify what I said when I said there's not a demand. I know there's a demand that every business wants it.
Right.
I'm just saying there's not a current demand where there's 15 businesses on a waiting list and we had to deal with people immediately based on a specific request on older policies.
Well, there might be tomorrow.
There might be,
Not
now
that
there's
much.
gonna be. So we're
I had
cutting
no
that
idea
short.
these existed
and-
till just.
Yeah, same.
Well, and I would like to throw out there, I agree with Dan. I think that our primary goal should be putting the power in the hands of the employees.
Yes.
And that the best way for us to interact with businesses is by selling units and then they can rent them. And maybe we discuss that at a future time.
But then, and just to pull that thread all the way through then,
If there's an appetite for that.
but just to pull that thread all the way through, then are we saying that we do not see any sort of rental program agreement with any other entities, including special taxing districts or taxing districts, or?
I think that the on-call program is its own thing that isn't even
not-
gonna be
I'm not even
falling
talking
under
on-call.
that.
I'm talking about if the fire department or the med center want to have dedicated units that we build in our
I
rental
just think
program.
No.
You think no?
I think this was a bigger conversation for a different day.
I agree with that.
I've never wanted to do that because it ends up, we can't give.
I think that's where the equity piece for me comes into play. If I am fine saying that we don't have master leases, as long as we don't have master leases, we don't
Yeah.
have those agreements with anybody. But I do feel like it is absolutely unfair to allow certain entities in certain industries to have them and not others.
Agreed. I don't want master
Okay.
leases, period.
I think master leases with special taxation districts, both, one, really recognizes for those truly critical positions like firefighters, teachers, nurses,
EMS.
EMS are critical infrastructure needs. I also think it benefits the town of Telluride as well, because we are able to partner with them and build a bigger project overall. They cover their half and we cover our half. As you build a bigger project, the cost per unit generally goes down.
But they're not bigger projects.
I disagree with that fundamentally because I could feel like we'd spend 5 hours arguing about whether teachers qualify or whether daycare students people qualify or mental health professionals qualify. And what at least the conversations we had on THA subcommittee 7 years ago, when I first got on this board, was we really need to stop doing this because it causes hours and hours of public comment from people coming in saying, well, this is why my industry and my special taxing district deserves it more than this one. And we just don't have the units for it. So I think that the way that we have approached some of these emergency first responders with our Virginia Placer 2 thing makes sense. But amongst the rest of our rental program, I don't think we should
Can
go down that road.
legal remind me, please, what the qualifications are to become a special taxation district? What sort of that threshold is to be considered and qualified as a special taxation district? Because I think that is important in this conversation.
Well, generally speaking, Colorado law sets up the organic statute for a special taxing district. So it will say you're authorized to set up an authority, a special district, a board pursuant to the following guidelines. So it usually is found, it's almost always found in Colorado law where it's authorized. Unless you're talking about another municipality, which can be in its own organic kind of authority.
So, but
Elections usually required.
an election is required, but the question, I guess, is I could propose and bring to the electorate a special taxation district for dog walkers or whatever, something that is outside of what we're talking about currently of what we sort of recognize as critical positions.
I
Can we get back
Yeah,
on
we need to
track a
move
little
on, but
bit?
I
No,
think,
but
I think what you're saying is right, and we need to recognize that there is a differentiation between a special taxation district and other things. We agree. I think we need to table it because we're getting in the weeds and move on.
This is exactly why I said, this is a different discussion for a different day because we've got a bigger issue at hand, which is dealing with our rental policies for people in our community to get into and make it more equitable. We can discuss the businesses, master leases more holistically when we have more time and a later date. And then if Geneva, as chair, wants us to give direction with these two master leases and then table the discussion for another time without making any other decisions about adding master leases, I think that would be wonderful.
Let's do it. So no master leases,
Okay, and transition the two.
transition those two, and we will not talk about this again for a little.
There's one more question in this section, and we definitely would like some direction on this. This is in regards to potentially unqualified households who might need prioritization. We have an MOU in place with the San Miguel Resource Center. Currently, it is stated that the person still has to meet the qualification standards. If we are contacted by SMRC and we have a unit available that is appropriate for their client, we will entertain that. It is not a permanent solution. It is a temporary landing place for someone in a critical situation, but we just want that question answered about unqualified versus qualified, right? That's the.
So currently, when you say they have to meet the qualifications, like work in the area, like all of the qualifications. It is an area where I think an exception is totally acceptable. You
Or
could be,
discretion.
or discretion, yeah, no, yeah, discretion, just thinking like, should it be a woman and her kids and she was a stay-at-home mom and wasn't working and needs to get out of her situation? I would hate for her not to have a place anywhere, because she wasn't working and needed a place. So,
I'm in favor of discretion at the staff level for this.
yeah.
Agreed.
For this
Yeah.
policy, you bet.
Yeah.
Do we want to mention other facets of it? So I will anyway. So employment, great. That's clear direction. What if it's a situation where it's a person who has other means and other available places to go, but they choose to come into one of our properties? Let's say they own collectively 4 properties and there's another place they could actually go. But for some reason, they just
I mean, is
don't
it
want
unsafe
to.
for them there because they could be found there potentially?
And I think this is
Again,
where
we
your
don't dig into the-
discretion,
Okay,
yeah.
so just.
I mean, I think if they own 4 properties and they're short-term renting them and want to maintain the income, so they want to move into Shandoka instead of that doesn't seem like a situation. But I think, yeah, if it's like a safety thing, or if their units are long-term rented and they literally can't, that's different.
I think your discretion is fine, and we just have to make sure the individual has an opportunity for safety, and then you can worry about, oh, they're renting another place, how do we fix that?
Yeah.
But we gotta put them in a situation where they can feel safe, and we can't judge what they own, what they don't own, how much money they make.
Yeah,
We've got them
the
safe
goal is to get
first and
them
then
to a safe
figure it all
place,
out
yeah.
later. If staff can handle that, I mean.
Okay.
Does staff feel empowered where you've gotten that person through that crisis mode? What then? Do you feel like you have an answer to that of, okay, you've gotten somebody out of a dangerous situation, you've gotten them in the landing pad, they've had a couple months to rework their situation, what happens to that person then?
The leases executed in those situations are usually pretty short term because it is meant to be a landing pad. If the person does qualify, I think there is still some discretion with respect to the wait list. So it's possible that that lease, if they qualify, could convert to a long-term lease. Otherwise, if they do not qualify, we would probably allow an extension of time until they were able to find alternate housing, so long as it's a reasonable period of time. It's not going to be 2 years. It might be 3 or 4 months.
Ultimately, it's a conversation with the advocates, so that there's a good timeline and plan in place, and obviously subject to change because situations may fall apart, but,
Seems reasonable to me.
Okay, so with respect to the reserved unit policies, I heard that we want to discontinue the practice now of master leases, but we might revisit that at a future time with respect to businesses and or special taxing districts. With respect to town employee prioritization policies, you're okay with the town currently maintaining that discretion. There are no limits. If it ever became an issue, we could always implement a policy then. I will probably try to craft some limiting language just in the interest of transparency to the public about what that level of discretion is and how we do retain it. But again, any of this could be revisited at any time. And then staff will also retain discretion when it comes to housing unqualified households with respect to possibly that MOU that we do have with the Resource Center or other exigent circumstances.
Great.
Okay.
Pets?
Yeah, so the last one is pets. Dan had mentioned this, I think 2 or 3 meetings back, just as something, there's always a lot to discuss. So I think as most of you now know, right now, Sunnyside is the only one of our rental properties that allows pets. So we have to accommodate emotional support animals, ESAs, and service dogs at all properties. We cannot charge pet rent for a service animal or a service dog or an ESA. We cannot charge a deposit for those animals either. Beginning this year, there was a new House bill that was implemented that does further limit our ability to charge pet rent and pet deposits. We have not updated the Sunnyside policy yet. It just hasn't come up, but that will be updated. So at the other properties that we have, I don't know if there is an appetite to start allowing pets, or if we want to just retain, the ESA service dog requirement that we already have to accommodate.
According to the staff memo and in my scene experience around Shandoka, I mean, it seems like there's just a lot of pets and I think.
ESAs.
Excuse me. Thank you. It seems like there's a lot of pets. Most of them, I assume, are ESAs, as was noted in the memo. Is switching to a policy that both encourages people to not abuse the ESA system, and allows for staff to potentially recoup from some damage or extra work and maintenance around it, picking up after pets. People aren't perfect about picking up after their pets. I think is a little bit of a win-win. I think that to a degree, all animals are emotional support animals, and that if we are trying to empower our citizens and give them better opportunities, I think that allowing them to have pets, but then compromising and having some pet rent or an additional pet deposit might be another workaround as well for those persons to recoup potentially additional damage that might happen under that, or potentially have a one-time pet fee, something to that nature as well. There's a number of ideas, but the point being, I'm in favor of allowing pets because I think that it's functionally operating that way anyways, and that it is a benefit to our residents. Is my opinion.
Kevin, it looks like you want to say
Yeah,
something.
I think we need to clarify, right? My understanding of the state law on that is you can neither charge an additional security deposit nor have the rent affected by whether there's a pet or an animal in that facility or not. That's my understanding of the recent changes.
You can charge a refundable pet deposit for a pet.
Right?
You
think that's
can.
capped at 300.
300.
There's a cap, yeah.
You can alternatively charge pet rent. We did not take that route at
Yeah.
Sunnyside yet. I mean, we might, I don't know.
But there is no pet fee that you would be able to
Yes.
charge that would not be refundable. So, and going back, so we can regulate ESAs and service dogs, meaning we can still require people to pick up after their animals, and we can say that they're in violation if we know that they don't. We can still require that all animals on property be on a leash. So there are certain things that we can regulate, but after this House bill was passed last year, financially, our ability to regulate pets it has been limited.
Not just
And
ESAs.
well, we can never charge for ESAs or service dogs.
So I know that like there are sometimes restrictions on what the deposit can be applied towards. So is it that it's damage caused by the pet in the unit is what is covered by that pet deposit? And it has to be like obvious, like the dog chewed on the molding.
The pet deposit would be separate from the rental deposit, but at the end of the day, if there was any damage to the unit, whether it was caused by the pet or other activity, that could be recovered. It would most likely be recovered first from the rental deposit, and then the pet deposit is in excess of that rental deposit. So let's say Geneva doesn't have a pet. She was charged $1,000 pet deposit. I do have a pet. I'm charged $1,300. There's $1,500 worth of damage to the unit. She would lose all of her deposit. I would lose all of my deposit, and then the pet deposit on top of that.
Even if like, I just am wondering, just from a practical, like, let's run through the scenario. That damage happened and it was because somebody's boyfriend came in and busted up a bunch of drywall. And then you have a $300 pet deposit and I'm the one with the pet and I say, that my pet did not cause that damage. You can't keep my $300 deposit. Is that a scenario when that would then be refundable back to me for that $300?
Yes.
Okay.
I see the benefits, sort of, Dan, that you're outlining, and especially when we want to be moving, we want the most flexibility for transfers within our program. But I am foreseeing that if we allow pets, the pet population is going to explode. And I think that the fact that there are so many people who've gone through the ESA certification process means that if someone really, really, really needs to do that, or really wants to, I mean, I don't want to make a judgment on that, that they can and are doing that. So I'm afraid of opening up, allowing pets as opposed to ESAs, which we must allow at all of our projects, because I just think that, it's about pet behavior and it's about the environment at the rental units and quiet and keeping, the amount of animals running around.
If I may, it's about
reasonable.
owner behavior.
Okay.
Can I clarify?
But yes.
Can you tell us how it's working?
We have had actually several complaints over the past 6 months or so, 12, I guess now, because the apartments are a year old, of lots of residents not cleaning up after their animals. They have asked for council requests. They have asked for a dog poop bag station to actually be put out there in the hopes that it will incentivize owners to pick up after their pets.
Thumbs up.
I'm surprised there's not one.
Yeah, put one up.
I think that our facilities maintenance staff would share Chairwoman Shaunette's concerns. Even just with the ESAs that we have. I'm sorry, I'm gonna just say it. They picked up 84, I think it was, bags of poop last spring. Summertime, summertime, from one area on the Shandoka property.
Isn't there other avenues on that front of enforcement of, wouldn't that be considered some form of littering, or
It is.
that this is outside of the conversation of whether or not that, even if that's an ESA or a working dog, there is a requirement to clean up after yourself for it. So that, to your point, I think is more to bad owners, not anything to do with the pets.
It could be a lease violation. It could also be a municipal court summons, or just a citation. Doesn't have to arrive the level of a summons. But of course, with all enforcement, they have to be caught, and even if someone is just leaving dog bag there, we don't always know who it belongs to. So there are problems with enforcement. There are ways to enforce, but actual possibility of enforcement can be problematic.
Can I just clarify about our policy? Because we keep saying the word pet, but are we really just talking about dogs? Because are other animals allowed in any of our rentals? Like, can you have a turtle? Can you have a bird? Can you have a hamster? Can you have a cat? What, are we talking about dogs or are we talking about all pets?
So technically Shandoka has a no pet policy blanket statement. Anyone who has an animal should be reporting to us that they have one. If a unit inspection is done and we, at least this is how we're doing it now, and we see that there is an animal in there, we make reference to it in the rental platform that we use. Primarily, usually when we're talking about pets in our housing buildings, it is dogs and cats because they're out and about and there's concerns with wildlife and there's concerns for various things. So I kind of like keeping it generalized as pet because we also want to know if someone has a 80-gallon fish tank in a 4th floor apartment. Because if something happens, they should hopefully have renter's insurance. And we would encourage them to do so if we discovered that. But generally speaking, when we talk about pets, dogs and cats come up to the surface. I would really love as staff to see a policy of some sort because cats have always been not counted historically at Shandoka, and there's been various excuses over the years given as to why, oh, we're just going to look aside if it's a cat. And that's because they're good mousers and it reduces the rodent population around the building and therefore it's helpful. However, we have seen some pretty awful unit turn situations where there have been cats present. So policy would be helpful for staff in this regard.
I love animals. I am concerned about the effects of opening this can of worms. I think we are talking about densely populated areas. I'm imagining if even 10 dogs live in a building and they start barking, like I think, you know, there's some very real like quality of life concerns for everyone in those units. I think the you know, issue of people not cleaning up after their pets is huge. I think the damage the pets could do to the inside of the units is sometimes irreversible, like urine smells can destroy a unit. And I really I'm concerned. I feel like we already, as Geneva said, have a pathway. If a pet is essential to your mental health, we have a pathway to allow that. But I do feel like this is a can of worms that would be opening up. I also feel like as someone who owns a pet and kind of regrets owning a pet, trying to find housing, free market housing in this town with a pet is a nightmare. And I feel like if we open this up, like half the tenants of Shandoka would go out and adopt pets. And then when we're talking about moving through the housing system, we would be this can of worms of barriers to then find other housing solutions would make it so that I think people would end up more stuck in those units than they already feel like they are, especially because Lawson doesn't allow dogs. And again, these are all personal decisions that people make for themselves, but I do think since there are these other complicating factors, it's also worth considering, you know, are we setting people up for success if everyone in Shandoka gets a pet and then all of the free market housing doesn't allow pets, which isn't true, but for by and large, I spent about a year trying to find somewhere to live with a cat like 8 years ago, and it was impossible. And I have one cat. So I just think that's worth considering. Just and the density of how many people we have living down there. If every apartment were allowed to have an animal that makes noise in our most densely populated part of town, it might, yeah.
Is anybody other than Dan for opening up pets being allowed?
Like really, I'm having a hard time with this one because I love dogs. Not a big cat fan, sorry. And I think we live in the perfect place to have them, recreationally. But, you know, it does do damage to our facilities. inside and out. The noise pollution could be an issue. And I think I just have a hard time telling people that already have all these restrictions on them that here's one more, but they're used to it, I suppose. And there is a pathway through the ESA should they really need it, but yeah, I'm having a hard time with this one.
Delaney?
And I wouldn't have a hard time with it if we weren't talking about it. If it just like not been brought up, I would be okay.
Just to clarify, so Sunnyside has a pet policy and that would remain in effect. That was discussed and decided upon years ago. I believe in part because of the nature of the different types of buildings that were there. There's actually townhomes. It's not just apartments. It's a little bit of a different mixed use place. And it is farther outside of town. So you're not in the urban center, if you will, and it isn't quite as densely populated per se. I guess depending on how we move forward with this, there could potentially be language written that gives council, THA subcommittee latitude based on a project's design to have a pet policy property specific going
like that.
forward.
Delaney, correct me if I'm wrong, Sunnyside, for example, we went with hard
One.
flooring.
Oh, yes, hard floor.
From a flooring standpoint, that's hard floors versus Shandoka has a fair amount of carpet still interior wise. So design, to your point, design elements are important when considering pets as well.
One other just question to raise, because my understanding of how rental policies currently are for Shandoka, it doesn't allow visitors to bring their pet as well. I do want to consider that because you're effectively saying, okay, if you have a partner that they have a pet, they can never come over, stay over, visit your apartment, you know, and does seem overly restrictive if we were to unilaterally enforce that and make that a hard rule.
Yeah, I'm on board with changing that.
But they can visit your apartment there without bringing their dog
You're not
too.
gonna leave your dog for an entire night if you're trying to stay over, if you're trying to build a life and a relationship with somebody else.
Yeah.
I also think it's asset management too, because we can't charge for replacing the carpet, we can't, if that person's coming in with a dog, I don't know. I don't know that we need to change any of the policies right now. I think that they're fine.
In the real world, there's properties that allow pets and there's properties that don't allow pets, and we are also operating
I mean, Telluride Lodge only allows owner occupied units to have pets.
Same.
No
with
renters and no short-term can bring their pets in. So, I mean,
And we heard in the Southwest area plan discussions that people really think that there's not enough green space in that part of town to run their pets, and they want a dog park and things like that. So I think if we increase the number of pets, that's only gonna feel more squeezed.
Well, and I'm in a similar position with Ashley where I'm in a condo unit that only owners are allowed pets, no renters or short termers. And sometimes like people bring dogs to units and they bark constantly and it like definitely disrupts the quality of life as someone who lives there full time. So I get nervous that this is opening up a can of worms where I can make a list of the negative impacts and the positive impacts are a shorter list. And that's where I'm having a hard time wanting to change it, even though I love animals.
I just view it as there's plenty of bad humans as well. You certainly get short-term rental visitors that are drunk and obnoxious and make messes and break things. And we have systems to deal with those bad apples when it comes to humans. I think if we implement similar policies for pets, we can similarly address bad apples when it comes to pets, especially when it comes to visitor pets. I hear from the group that not allowing owners, that's fine. But I just think with such limited options available for people, a level of accommodation that isn't so rigid is a give and a way to support our tenants.
So what,
You
so
just
what does
said
that, but what does that look like? So you like are in a relationship and you're living in Shandoka and
you don't have a dog, but your partner has a dog. And then they spend 5 nights a week at your place because you have, your roommates are on an opposite schedule from you or whatever it is. Like, at that point, do you sort of de facto have a dog?
I mean, I hear that question. I certainly have considered it also, but I think this is again where to earlier points made of micromanaging these hypotheticals. Yes, that is a possibility, but it's also a possibility where you stay with a really rigid pet policy that doesn't allow visitors to it. A partner comes over one night, Delaney happens to see it, and you terminate that person's lease because you're in violation of your lease.
I don't think
That
it
really
means
feels.
terminating your.
The point of this whole exercise, the point of this whole exercise is to create policies that allow for consistent enforcement. And so if we are crafting that policy and Delaney is asking for rigid outlines of where our policies lie, I believe she's asking for more tools for enforcement. And if the direction we give is, this is our hard line, then as much as Delaney is not trying to kick people out, I know she's not, but whoever the next person in that seat is, or if she feels like she's back up against a wall with the policies we have set, I think that that's reasonable to ask.
You're saying if people knowingly violate their lease repeatedly now and they are at risk of being evicted, that's not fair to them, so we should allow the behaviors that they're doing.
We should allow a pet, we should allow some, I think allowing a dog is a reasonable accommodation within our rule set.
And I don't
Teddy.
think it's.
I think we need to
I
wrap
think
this up.
is very
We're at
agree.
noon. Teddy, go ahead.
So I have a dog. I love my dog, but I'm lucky enough to own my house, and the wear and tear that dog puts on my asset is significant, and I choose that. These properties are our asset as a town, and I think there's a reason why free market landlords are prohibiting dogs and cats, because the damage is going to be significant. And yes, unfortunately, some really good owners are going to be penalized by this. But as a general rule, again, I have a dog. I love dogs. I wish everyone could have a dog wherever they lived, but that's just not the reality when it's our asset that we're trying to protect. I think that what we could potentially do is, since we don't have a lot of historical information on this, is maybe we revisit it down the road. When we're tweaking these policies every couple of years, and see if we want to allow it based on what we will then know is hard facts and information at Sunnyside. What did the units with pets look like when they were turned over? Are people continuing to complain about dog poop and barking and all kinds of stuff? Because the flip side of this is the last thing I want to do is make staff's job worse because they're babysitting bad owners. And so if push comes to shove, I got to go. No pets, same policy, but we can revisit it based on our own data at Sunnyside down the road.
Do we want to address the visitation of pets? I mean, I feel like we could do something like a 24-hour period, like a pet cannot exceed being on the property for a 24-hour period. So it's like, if you spend one night, dog's there, whatever, can't stay another night, it needs to go home. I don't know. I'm just like, if I get where Dan is saying that it is difficult, especially if you have a significant other or you have somebody visiting that has a pet that they're bringing. Is there any leeway that we want to give for visitors that are bringing a pet in, or just
I feel like if you
not?
allow a certain amount of time, you're allowing all the time.
Yeah, like the
Delaney doesn't
enforcement
have
of
time to
that
Okay.
is.
monitor that. Kevin, what did you want to add?
Yeah, this issue has come up in the past. It's even come up with regard to a visitor asserting an ESA animal, is my recollection. The no pet policy applies to whether you're a tenant or you're a visitor bringing in a pet to visit a tenant. It also applies if a visitor is asserting some sort of an ESA animal visiting a lawful tenant there, and we have said you're not allowed to do that. I don't think I think we need to be clear because it's been raised as, is it unclear? It's not unclear. It's very clear. There's a no pet policy. There are exceptions that we have to recognize under federal law for either a service animal or an ESA. But that doesn't mean that a visitor gets a pass to come and visit and bring a dog. It's a no pet policy and the leaseholder is responsible for that, whether it's their animal or an animal that's visiting them.
And you're more apt to have a disruptive pet when it's a guest. I've seen it at my house numerous times. They're just not in a comfortable location. I've seen it with tenants in my complex. And it's not as easy as, oh, my friend's coming over and the dog's gonna be great. Yeah, that'll happen sometimes, but sometimes it won't. And then it falls upon staff to figure it out. And that's just more work for you guys too.
And can I just say, in case people are listening, if we find out there is an animal violation, we do not evict anyone or non-renew them. They get a warning. Sometimes they even get 2 or 3 warnings. We just try to be very clear. This is the policy. You're responsible legally.
We can't evict until there's a second violation. So if you have a pet, if your visitor has a pet and we find out, then there's a demand for compliance that's issued. And only upon repeat violation or if the animal stays there, that's when we would have grounds to terminate a lease. So this isn't instant action for violating a lease. You're going to lose your housing. There's more to it than that.
Just to be 100% clear, Kevin, you're saying that the visitors cannot bring an emotional support animal and that is still prohibited.
ESAs are only accommodated for those residing at the property. A service dog is treated differently. If you have a service dog, the service dog is allowed anywhere.
So to maybe try and wrap a bow on this, it seems like the majority of us would like to keep the pet policy as it is. And maybe in a year or two revisit and see what we've learned at Sunnyside since we have made pets allowed at one of our rental units, but expanding them across all units seems like too big of a jump right now. Is that a statement that?
Well, and that we want to take each project, we're not going to make a blanket pet policy, that we're going to take each project with its individual attributes into consideration as to whether or not it is a project that will be one that wants to host pets or not.
The default is no pets allowed. And by project, for instance, Voodoo, maybe you want to allow pets at Voodoo, but that's a future conversation. But the default will be no pets allowed, keep the current policy, but you carved out Sunnyside. There might be other properties in the future that you also want to carve out.
Could we look at the calendar real quick? We know that we have laid it out to give you a first draft at the June 25th meeting. That means we have to have it ready by next Wednesday, so less than a week. We were curious if you would be amenable to the idea of having on June 25th, a discussion of a few more ancillary items, i.e. the grievance and appeals policy. Thought there was one more. Is that it?
Grievance appeal procedures, and then also if there's anything else, we probably want to discuss tiers one more time. Hopefully it'll be a much shorter conversation. But I think Delaney and I have now realized after this last very quick turnaround time that trying to meet a deadline of next week for a full draft of these policies would be very hard given the other workloads that we have.
And then we would present the first draft at the July meeting, which is the 16th. And then ask for potentially a special meeting in between the 16th and the August 6th council meeting, THA, part of council.
Sure.
Yep. Okay, great.
Work on that.
Thanks, everybody.
Wait, did we have any, were we supposed to do public comment or anything?
It was not on the agenda. I think we're, I mean, I don't have the Zoom up. I think that this was a work session for us, and at the next meeting, when we have more of a document, that's easier for the public to digest as well, then we will love to hear a lot of public comment.
So if
Not
anybody's
today.
listening, there you go.
I've got a work obligation. I've got to run. Thank you all.
Okay,
Problem, Dan, see ya.
thanks, Dan.
Hi, Dan.
Thanks, staff.
Thanks, Ally. Thanks, Delaney. Great job getting through all this.
It's special.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Did we adjourn?
Thank you for bringing that up.
We are now adjourned at 12:10 PM.